I don't mind if you call me an Andy, by the way. I've been called worse, and by professionals too. We're all anti-something or other, I hope.
Today I'm sitting down with Dr. Steve Wolfgang. You've already told me I can just call you Steve.
Whatever you like.
And I wanted to come. You've already seen the other interviews that I did.
I have.
And the interesting thing about you, I mean, I've looked at your work quite a bit, and you will be the first trained historian that I'm actually talking with.
All right.
And the big thing that was interesting about you, you would say quite frequently, it goes in about windows of 60 years where we start losing people who have real life memory.
Yes.
And you said by the time we get to a third generation of a division, all the memory is gone. Yeah. Real life memory. Pretty
much. And I mean, that's true in secular history as well. I mean, if you look even at from the American Revolution to the Civil War, 1781 to 1861, that's 80 years. I put it maybe a little more like 80 than 60, but roughly. And then from, say, just to pick nice even numbers, 1861 to 1941, when we entered World War II, that's 80 years again. And people in that lifespan, there's nobody alive who has an adult memory of what went on. Now, you may have some people at 80 years old or 90 even, but their memories are childhood memories. They don't really have an adult memory of what happened. And so, yes, we do tend to forget what went on, and that happens in church history as well. And you may have heard me do the Campbell, Stone, Scott leaving the Baptist churches in the 1820s and 30s. And then you get up about, say, 70 years after that into the 1890s. I mean, everybody dates the division in 1906 to the census, but it had happened for decades before that was happening. It's a process. And then if you come up from the 1890s, which by then the lines were pretty clearly drawn. I mean, 1906, everybody, I mean, even the government recognized that there were differences between these groups of people. And then if you come up another 70 years, I mean, by the 1960s, the institutional division is pretty well finished. I mean, you have going back to the post-World War II generation of, an explosion in orphanages that we may want to talk about later. It's one of the things that I think Alan left out of the story that he tells. But you get this explosion of institutions, including colleges that are begging for funds. Then you get the Herald of Truth in the early 50s, the huge budgetary demands for TV and radio time. And you get the first printed debate in 1954, the Indianapolis debate, and then several follow. And the quarantine in 54. But by the 60s, it's pretty well over. I mean, the lines are drawn, and there's a process of what Alan Hires talked about, which is absolutely true, that the non-institutional and institutional groups, we don't know each other.
Right.
I've tried to keep some feeble line of communication open myself with some of my brothers in the institutional camp, just as I have with some of my Baptist friends from seminary and Wesleyan Methodist friends from undergraduate school. But we're just different. We're in different orbits, and we don't know each other.
Well, that is the other reason, aside from you just being generally a historian. I think by now people would have an idea. Of why I wanted to talk with you is you are representing its own segment of that division from the late 18s to the 1960s. But the one thing that my introduction to you was, and I want to say this too about what the mindset was at Memphis in a moment. I discovered you by first reading the 1990 Dallas meeting, and then I watched it on video. And as everybody was feeling each other, you were at the microphone, and this was what really got me about you was you're just mid-sentence, and you said, by the way, I don't mind if you guys call me an anti. And it was just on the table, and I thought, you're here to do business. It was serious. But where we are now, you said folk don't know each other.
Right.
And that's why I'm here, is people will hear that term anti, and it will be this catch-all for anything under the sun. And as we have this conversation, the statement was, no one individual can fix all the division, but possibly we can understand each other better. Yeah. I want people to stop misrepresenting you.
Well, I appreciate that. And just a couple of things. I don't use the word represent, and I don't think you meant it this way, but I don't officially represent anybody
you're not
but Steve.
elected.
Okay, yeah, that's
You're not an
correct. I
elected official.
don't want to be a spokesperson for anything but me. I'm a member of a local congregation.
Yes.
I'm a gospel preacher. So there's that. But yes, everybody's an anti or an anti.
To something.
We're all, I don't know whether anti-Catholic, anti-abortion, anti-communist. We were all, everybody who opposed the instrument was an anti. Back in the 1890s, that was the label that was pasted on them. In fact, it was one of the more polite ones, mossback or whatever. You're behind the times, you're not with the program, you're stupid, you don't understand the Bible clearly, and that's the connotation of it. So, but yeah, I'm opposed to some things.
Right.
Now, I don't really like being characterized and known for what I oppose. I'd rather be known for some things that I advocate, that I'm for. But everybody's got an anti-side to them.
I'd be fine just calling you a Christian.
Yeah.
Just to label you that way. I mean, you're a brother in Christ. When you said we would get characterized as not, having sense to figure out X, Y, Z, I was telling Dad before we got here, the mindset, and I was at Memphis School of Preaching about 10 years ago.
Okay.
And the mindset that you would hear instructors there talk about, and they'd use the word anti, they basically would say to the class, well, these antis don't have any good reason. They can't figure their way out of a box. Now, everybody open up your Homer Haley commentary. It was like they weren't telling us, and they weren't telling us about you, Ed Harrell, Robert Turner, Melvin Curry. It was, now that I'm 10 years separated and I've started looking at the histories, it's ridiculous. Like you said, everyone's going to be opposed to something.
Yeah.
And this idea that you couldn't even, they didn't tell us about Bob Waldron, his books, nothing. So it was very, very insulated, and I find that very distasteful now.
Richard Hughes told me once that when he was a student at Abilene in the 60s, when Ed Harrell's first book came out, that all of the guys in the Restoration history classes were like, who is this guy? He must be a disciple, because the book was published by the Disciples Historical Society, and he didn't write kind of hagiographic history, sort of like in the Earl West mode. And I have a lot of respect for Earl West. I'll tell you that backstory in a few moments. Earl performed the wedding ceremony for my parents. They were high school friends back before all of these issues came up, before the division came. But he tried to tell a story very fairly and honestly based on the copious research in the original sources, which is what historians do. I mean, hopefully we may all have opinions, we may even, some spin may sneak into it, but if you're doing your job as a historian, you're saying not that this is what should have happened, this is what happened. I mean, it's like the story of the historian who came home from a day's work, and his wife asked him, what did you do? And he told what he's working on, and she said, well, they shouldn't have done that. And he's like, well, no, they probably shouldn't have killed all those people and stolen the money, but the fact is, that's what they did. And so that's what history is about, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not. The story is the story.
Well, and also too, you said childhood memories. One thing too is, when I said everything the picture I was getting at Memphis was insulated. Folk will not, so I'm 30 years old, and I can just tell you that the majority of my age group, my generation, they're not going to know the things that were being said on both sides. Yeah. So no one, majority won't know of my generation that John Armstrong was telling people that their salvation could depend on sending
to the college. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And if you want to have anything on that.
Well, I was just going to say, picking up on, and I know this is important to you because I've seen it in some of your other videos, the education or making information available to the next generation. One reason I organized the Nashville Meeting, and there's a whole backstory to that we may get into just for information's sake, but I was I was in Danville, Kentucky for 29 years. And in addition to teaching 20 years of that at UK, we had classes there that were sort of like a school of preaching. That is, we met every day, Monday through Friday, in 3 trimesters, and the idea was they would get a course in every book in the Bible, sometimes, together, like Minor Prophets was a single course, Synoptic Gospels was a course, but they would get exposed to every book in the Bible, plus sermon preparation, plus denominational doctrines, plus I taught a quarter course on debates where we just read and listened to tapes of a lot of debates. But I had a lot of my younger students. I started doing this when I was 30. That's when I moved. I was how old I was when I moved to Danville. But they were asking the same kind of questions. What went on in these past controversies? What don't we know about it? And one reason I kind of organized the Nashville meeting was to say, all right, let's lock a bunch of preachers in this hotel room and let them discuss it, and let's just see, are there new arguments? Has somebody come up with a better biblical argument on something, or is it the same old thing? Is it just a preacher fight? What was this? And so, my students were kind of the drivers of that. So I very much appreciate what you're doing in trying to make information available, going back and interviewing some of us old graybeards, whether we agree with each other or not. Right. And actually, there's a lot that I agree with, both in Alan's video and Rubel's. We may or may not want to talk about this, but Rubel and I, at one point, I would have said we were not fast friends, close friends, but we carried on. We were not living in the same area. We corresponded. I would stop in Nashville when I was there. Nashville's my wife's home, so we were frequently in the area. And I would stop by Ashwood and we'd visit. But I guess I'll go ahead and tell this, and we may want to get back to the Nashville meeting. But Rubel was there. I don't remember if he spoke or not, but he may have, and I would have been happy. If he didn't, I would have been happy for him too. Mm-hmm. But I wasn't organizing the other side. The other people were putting together the slate of institutional preachers.
And which one is this?
This was the Nashville meeting. This is what started. Dallas came out of Nashville, and Dallas would not have occurred if it had not been for Nashville. Because
88 and then 90.
Yes, 88 and 90. And let me tell you, finish the Rubel story.
Okay.
But I had this conversation with Rubel, and we were friends, but I said, your folks are not here. That it was not well attended at all. And this is Nashville, where institutional churches outnumber NI churches by 10, 12, 20 to 1, whatever. But it was probably 10 to 1 the other way. And I said, Rubel, why are they not here? And he's like, well, our people are out helping homeless people and AIDS patients. And I felt it as a very condescending kind of an answer. Yes. So, and I understand Rubel has moderated somewhat in some of his views, perhaps. I don't know. We've not had any contact, but that was like, okay, you don't have to draw me a picture. Right. I get the idea of what the level of importance is for these issues here. But you were kind of quizzically looking at me about Nashville. Do you remember the old Bryant Shank meetings? Does that mean anything to you?
Robert Shank.
Yeah,
yes.
Robert Shank. Marvin Bryant, I think, was the original guy. He was a Presbyterian preacher who became a Christian. And then Robert Shank came along, who wrote 2 of the best books, Life in the Sun and Elect in the Sun. I still recommend them. I required our students at Danville to read them. Whether they did or not is one thing, but you couldn't pass the test without knowing a little bit about that. And so they would go into a city and set up a meeting in a hotel, invite a lot of denominational preachers, and try to display the plea to go back and restore New Testament Christianity that you and I would probably agree on. But they involved a younger preacher by the name of Alan Cloyd. So you had Presbyterian, you had Shank, who was a Baptist, and then Alan had been was in the Joplin
Independent Christian
wing
Church.
section, whatever, of the independent Christian churches, yeah. And Alan's parents lived in Louisville. That's where he grew up, and I was preaching at Expressway at the time. This is in the 70s. And there was some friction in the Christian churches there as they were kind of transitioning from what I would call a restorationist orientation to more of an evangelical megachurch kind of thing. This is the Bob Russell era Southeast Christian in Louisville, which is, I don't know if you've been there or not, but it's a huge megachurch that would rival anything. Same in Lexington, the South Side Church there. The guy who was there actually made the leap and came up here to Willow Creek. I mean, directly from Christian church to Willow Creek before it exploded. You may be familiar with all of the coverage in the Chicago Tribune and Christianity Today covered the blow up at Willow Creek. Anyway, I stray from my storyline. But Alan's parents started coming to Expressway on Sunday night. And that's how I met Alan. And they actually came for quite some time. Tolerated everything I preached on, including instrumental music. They didn't like it much, but they kept coming until the thing that killed it was I preached on the Masonic Lodge one night and just put up a bunch of quotations. I mean, really nothing but quotations of Masonic literature. Well, that tore. But in the process, I met Alan and became familiar with him. And he came to me at one point and said, "Can we do something like the Joplin-style meetings that Rubel was involved in to some extent?" I attended several of them. They kind of started at Bethany in the 70s, and then there were some in Cincinnati and Lexington. You may know the history of all that better than I do. I attended a few of them, but I said to Alan, yes, we'll try to see if we can get something like that off the ground. And so, and feel free to edit any of this out that you think is not appropriate. That's fine with me. But Alan actually came to Florida College, this would have been about 86 or 7, to the lectures, and I introduced him to some people, Melvin Curry, Harry Pickup Jr., some of the names that you've mentioned, and we agreed we'd kind of like to do this. And so we chose Louisville as a sort of a central site. I mean, it helped that, I had preached in Louisville and knew a lot of the people there and knew the infrastructure, but then we decided, no, let's move it to Nashville. So we put it in a hotel. I booked the Doubletree Hotel because my idea was, we do debates and everybody comes and they sit on their side of the auditorium and everybody leaves. But I wanted some, if possible, conversation in the coffee shops afterwards. People maybe up in each other's rooms talking about it. And some of that happened. Some of that went on. But that was how the Nashville meeting came about. It went through, Alan kind of dropped out of the picture. I forget who was it, I can't think of his first name, Brother Alexander at Preston Road School of Preaching in Dallas. Took it for all and then had some health problems, and finally Calvin Warpula.
Yeah, that's who I was thinking.
Yeah, he's the one who kind of set the slate of speakers on the other side up, and that's how I first came to know Calvin. So that's the backstory of the Nashville meeting, but it was so, the rift between the progressives in the institutional, the I churches, if I may. I mean, if they're in I churches, I guess they're I churches. They were very upset at hearing people like Bill Sweatman, Randy Mayu, who I think are probably no longer even associated with Churches of Christ now, but statements like, we didn't have the Bible for 400 years after the New Testament, how could it be a pattern? Yeah. And then just very baldly, if we think building a gymnasium will help us in our outreach to the community, we're going to build it regardless of what the Bible may say or not say about it.
So would you say by the 80s, and this is like jumping kind of into the middle.
Go right ahead.
And we'll go back to a bit earlier. But would you say, though, by 1988, would you have called them unrecognizable? As far as like these hermeneutical principles.
Oh, very different. I don't know about unrecognizable because things have a kind of a gradualism to it. They don't just jump out so that you can say, oh, wow, that's very much different from this. I mean, that's how a change occurs, is it's bit by bit. It's Galatians 1, It's not another gospel, but it's something that's a perversion is one word I guess we'd use. But to go back to the meeting itself, after Nashville, some of the very conservative preachers that I had talked with, specifically Johnny Ramsey and Roy Lanier Jr., came to me and said, can we do this again, but with just those of us that can still kind of talk to each other?
Right.
Because as you know, if we disagree about a biblical principle or a text, we can still talk about that. I mean, there's even some commonality going back 50, 60 generations in church history, back into the Reformation and even before, and even with some Catholic scholars, where if we're talking about what does a biblical text say, we can have a conversation about that, even if we disagree. But if somebody says, I don't care what the Bible says, or what the Bible says really doesn't matter, or yes, the Bible says this, but we live in the 20th century or the 21st, and therefore things are different. I mean, you might as well talk to the wall over there as to try to have a conversation with that person. So Johnny and Roy Lanier came to me and said, can we do this again with just the sort of conservative, moderate, whatever you want to call it, of the institutional people? And I said, all right, on a couple of conditions, you have to agree to advertise this among the institutional people. Let's not do this again and have just, the antis show up and nobody else shows up for it. We already know what we believe, and we're interested in hearing what other, has anybody come up with a different argument, a better argument, a new argument? Is there a biblical text we've ignored? Is there something we don't understand? Yeah, let's listen to that. So they did. They advertised it pretty well, and still didn't have a huge turnout there. And the common comment from those that were there in Dallas was, where is the younger generation of the institutional people? They had a lot of older people, with Hewlin Jackson, Adrian Doran, people like that. And I think the answer to it is that's the generation that was beginning to make that trek into the progressive movement. These are the guys that were reading Rubel's book and other writings. They were John Mark Hicks, Leonard Allen, and I think that was a potent observation, that there's a generation that had begun to make that trek and was really not interested in talking about orphanages or the Herald of Truth or the bigger issues of, can a church support a human institution, or can churches not only cooperate but form a kind of hierarchical collective where you have smaller churches sending money to the mother church or the sponsoring church.
Well, let's use that, because
go.
At this moment I would say we would still have my generation saying, like, I still don't know what these meetings are about. And so you wrote, and I think everyone should read it, and I think it was around either 88 or 90, or actually it would be in that time frame. You wrote an article, very brief, and you said 10 things you need to know about those orphan-hating antis. And so one thing, like I said earlier, it's just this catch-all. So in that you had a brief list, and you said it's not synonymous with individuals who use one cup. It's not synonymous with having no Bible classes. And then one thing that you said that I thought was really important was, when it came down to what to do about orphans, you said we are all in agreement that warehousing kids in a dormitory is not good for anybody. And that is a moment where the fact that you don't get recognition for that, and it continues to be this thing of, oh, they don't care about orphans. I don't like, my dad calls it dormitory style. I don't like just boxing these kids in, and you don't either.
Right.
So what it came down to, and let's go back to what you said about childhood memory.
Okay.
So in the division, the big things was, I think the conversation really just came down to, what is the work of the local church, and how do we do it?
Yes.
And so you have, and I have to say it this way, in some sense have always been involved, because you have a very early memory of how the division happened with your dad.
Yes.
As far as, and I think it's beneficial for people to hear how a child takes in hearing their dad having to resign. Can you tell that?
Sure. My mom and dad were married at the Irvington Church in Indianapolis in 1946. Dad came back from the war, and their childhood friend, or they'd been high school friends anyway, I don't know how far back, was Earl West, who had just come back, I think, from Pepperdine, and Earl performed their ceremony, and mom and dad, my dad was an elder at Irvington, which at that time was perhaps the largest Church of Christ north of the Ohio River. Maybe Thayer Street in Akron, maybe some others might have been, but they'd have an attendance of 500-600 people on Sunday morning. Big Methodist church that they had bought. And Earl, when he left to go, I think he left first to go to teach at Freed Hardeman in the 50s, and another preacher came in, and the push started for supporting the institutions. My grandfather resigned partly as a result of that. Another elder who's kind of on the left wing, I guess, resigned, and But my dad eventually was told, he was a deacon and the treasurer, either write a check to the orphanage, I won't name which one, but or you can turn in the checkbook and go elsewhere if you can't get with the program. Which doesn't leave a young guy in his early 30s, maybe a little bit older just than you are, a lot of room to maneuver. And so they and a lot of other people from different Indianapolis churches that were going through the same thing migrated over to what had been the old North Indianapolis church, the old Daniel Sommer church, that had moved out to a new building. The old building on 29th Street was taken when I-65 was put in the 60s. And so there's this brand new building that would seat 250, 300 people, and it kind of swelled with members that had been, I would say, forced out of or left, and for whatever reason. I mean, there was a lot of rancor on both sides. I mean, let's be honest, it's not all a one-sided thing. And anger begets anger, and angry words are rashly spoken, as the hymn says.
Right.
So I'm not trying to paste all the blame on any one thing, but that's how that happened, and how I came to be familiar with the whole Sommer milieu, which is another thing we want to talk about, but maybe we put that on the parking lot for right now if you want to pursue.
Well, one thing, I'll ask you a question, but I did want to say this. Another thing that I hear about when I was in school, it's like the label and the idea that goes with it, anti is always crusty old curmudgeon, blah, blah, blah. And so when you said it's on both sides, there are plenty crusty old curmudgeon institutional folk. So
and non-institutional. I mean, it's not a one-way street in terms of attitude. That's certainly true. But it is also true that the levers of power in the Brotherhood in the 1950s were with the institutional individuals. And basically, as I think I say in my tract, they were sent a message: go play in the street, play in the traffic. We can live without you. And in some ways, that's a repetition of what happened in the earlier division over the instrument of the Missionary Society. I mean, a lot of these things recur and repeat. Let me come back to one thing, though, before I forget it. I do say in that article about the orphan-hating antis, I make some that they're different from the one cup and no Bible class. However, and somebody you should interview is a friend of, if you want to, is a friend of mine. I don't know if you know Clint DeFrance. Shows up on my Facebook page occasionally, who has long been in the one cup, one loaf churches of Christ. And my conversations with him lately, where I've come to appreciate and understand more their viewpoint, and he makes the point, we are non-institutional. That is, we don't have any institutions. And also underscores the point that for many years, most churches of Christ didn't support institutions. Right. I mean, this was a 20th century phenomenon for the most part. But I think it's useful for us to have these conversations, and I've tried to open up communication lines with some of my one cup here, not only in the Chicago area. We go to each other's meetings. I've gone to some of their they call them, I went to their March meeting over in Missouri just to kind of get to know some of these brothers and so forth. And we've exchanged hymnals, and there's just a lot of commonality there. So yes, differences, and the problem there would be I could worship with them. I mean, I have worshiped in one cup churches. I don't have to have multiple containers, although many people prefer that. The problem is they can't worship with me. Their conscience will not allow them, their understanding of Scripture will not allow them to have table fellowship, to have Sunday assembly fellowship with me. So, and then that's a problem we may want to get into also, is it's far easier in some ways to talk to somebody on your theological right than on your theological left, where their issue is not your issue on the right. Their conscience issue is not my issue. And so I don't have a problem saying, we could worship together, and at least for some period of time, and I've made this offer when I was in Atlanta to a one cup congregation, or to a couple from there, that we could forego the use of the cup, of multiple containers, if it would help get us to, while we study the issue, if it would help get us to a place of unity. But I can't say that to somebody on my left who's pushing an instrument, for example, or has theologically what I would call liberal viewpoints that I can't endorse or wouldn't be comfortable being involved with in terms of congregational fellowship. And so anyway, that's...
Well, before we move into Daniel Sommer, I would want to ask you, though, about you being you were a child, your dad's resigning as the treasurer. There's two options. So when I was a child, my dad did explain everything that
Okay.
went on in the church. I mean, we had a split when I was young that was explained to me as best as a child could understand it.
Okay, yeah.
And when church discipline would happen, that would be explained as best as a child could understand it. And so essentially, I think that as kids look at things, I just want to ask you if you can remember that. Did you think, I think you essentially have two options. You see your dad resigning, and he actually would have, I think you have said before, you heard him do it over the phone probably to your granddad.
Yeah.
So do you go away as a child saying, well, this is stupid? Or do you say, no, this is very serious?
Yeah. A little bit of both. I mean, the first childhood reaction is, why do I have to leave all of my Sunday school buds that I, played with after church on Sunday morning and Wednesday nights, and vacation Bible school and all of that? But they did try to explain. I mean, I was 10 years old at the time, thereabouts, what was happening. And my dad was pretty good at, number one, when he would write checks he was the treasurer, and once a month he would gather the kids around the dining room table where that was done, and he'd have a book of maps. My dad was a map maker. That was his job, and where he made the maps that George Patton kept running off of in World War II, and was a printer for different firms all of his life. But he'd get them out and said, this check is going to Leslie Diesel Camp in Nigeria, or this is going to this preacher that we support up in North Dakota or Wisconsin or somewhere. And they were supporting a lot of people. So we understood that a part of the issue was, do we send support directly to these people who are in the field, or do we send it to a mother church, a sponsoring church, and let them do the work that this congregation ought to be doing? So there was some discussion of that, and my dad and granddad would frequently have discussions in his home, in our home, that centered on this. So in addition to the times where they would try to sit me down and explain things, I'm overhearing these adult conversations. Yes. And preachers were often in our homes. When preachers would come for meetings, they'd often be in our home or my granddad's home, and I'd be sitting at the dinner table or around the corner listening to all of this. And it was about this time that I got into my dad's and my grandfather's bookshelf. They had Earl West Search for the Ancient Order, Pritchard's Light from the Ancient Past. That's what got me into archaeology when I was probably 11, 12, 13 years old. And so I don't know if that answers your question or not, but yeah, there was both direct and indirect teaching about this is what's happening here.
But it was something, certainly, it was presented as this is very serious.
Yes.
And you picked that up.
Yes.
And I wanted that on there to say, for people who would be looking on the outside of this and say, well, I just think a bit of all of it is silly. I don't think that you can tell someone who had it when they were 10 years old, come into the house.
Yeah.
I don't think that anyone could tell you now, well, all this was silly all along.
Yeah.
And if someone says, well, who carries baggage from when they're 10 years old? Everybody.
Everybody does.
Everybody
yes.
does. So all of this is there, and like you said, y'all weren't anti-mission. You referenced Leslie Diesel Camp in Nigeria. It just had to do with how do we do this work of the church. Yeah. So that's
Does a local church do its own work, or do we organize in a sort of a hierarchical thing with a sponsoring church, or a missionary society, which is essentially what a sponsoring church arrangement is. We just change the labels.
Right.
Instead of it being a human institution, now we call it the Lord's Church. But to use a Robert Turner illustration, if you made in this case, the Cook County Sheriff's Office, if you made the Cook County Sheriff the National Defense Director, he became the Secretary of Defense. Does that mean that he's now overseeing the Army, or is he still just in charge of a sheriff's department?
Right.
So,
and I think that's another one is, I don't like the conglomeration power brokering that goes on. And it's like, young guys just would hear what we're talking about now, and I don't know that they see it that way.
Yeah.
And because someone says, well, I'm just operating at a local congregation, until they come in and they start trying to tell you what to do.
Yeah.
So
no Andy could state it better.
So yeah. So one of the things that we said earlier, now I want to start moving into Daniel Sommer.
Okay.
And so I said a moment ago that young guys wouldn't know, most of them wouldn't know that John Armstrong, who was the son-in-law to James A. Harding,
right,
he was telling people that your salvation might rely on it. There's a questionable quote, but Richard Hughes tended to acknowledge it, that G.C. Brewer made at Abilene. The quote was, "Any congregation that won't put Abilene in the budget has the wrong preacher."
1938.
That's right.
And there was another guy in the 1919 Abilene lectures that you saw up on the top shelf of my library who made this Henry Speck, I think was his name, made this a very similar comment. And Abilene was trying to set up a graduate school at that time. Mike Casey's written a lot about the history of that. And he made essentially the same kind of statement, that the church that won't put the college in its budget has the wrong preacher. In other words, you elders need to get with the program, fire your preacher, get rid of him if he won't get with the program. Right. Yes.
And so, I mean, some of these conversations, like you were saying a moment ago, to my left, to my right. If I'm over here saying, conscience-wise, I don't know that I can do that, and then John Armstrong says, "Well, you might be going to hell for it." Yeah. There's no middle ground there.
No.
I mean, that was a hard stand.
Yeah.
And so with those individuals, I brought it with me. So you are a historian, but there's going to be very few people that I can talk to about Daniel Sommer.
All right.
And this is your master's thesis. Yeah. And so it was either 1988 or 99, they called you an expert on Restoration history, and you said, just call me avid. And then someone else put in the bulletin, he's an adamant student. And so, but for Daniel Sommer, I mean, earlier I said representative. I think you're going to be an authority on Daniel Sommer.
Yeah, and of course I grew up at the North Indianapolis Church that became Emerson Avenue, is what the old North Indianapolis Church that Sommer was an elder in for years and preached when he moved there in 1894 until his death in 1940. He was a member and at times an elder. Somebody else you should interview if you're interested, especially about Foy Wallace Jr., but also Daniel Sommer, is Terry Gardner. I don't know if you know Terry or not.
I know of him. I've never met him.
Okay. He's got a lot of collectible things that you'd be interested in. But I grew up sitting on a pew either in front of or behind Bessie Sommer, depending on if I was sitting with my grandparents or my parents. My grandparents were a little more lenient with what I could do, balancing a pencil on my finger in church or something like that. But I grew up around, and then when I moved to Marion, Indiana, the first place that I preached full time, I preached in Florida for a year while I was at FC. But Cecil Willis was the preacher in Marion, was the editor of Truth Magazine. And the Arlington meeting had just occurred in January of '68, which was while I was at FC, and I remember Melvin Curry, Clinton Hamilton, and some others who were in that meeting would come back and occasionally talk about it in Bible classes, not pejoratively, but they would present the arguments. And if you've read the Arlington meeting, that was a pretty even-handed meeting where brethren who had known each other for years said, "I'm happy to continue this conversation. I'm glad to get to know you better." So there was that sort of thing. But one of my first assignments was to proofread the Arlington Meeting book while it was still in printer proofs. And when I did Nashville and Dallas, I'll get back to Sommer in a minute, but I modeled the Nashville and Dallas meetings after the format of the Arlington Meeting. I mean, we used the same topics and used kind of the same back and forth format of major speech, rebuttal or response, and then other people could get in on the discussion with shorter 5-minute speeches. But when I got ready then to do my master's thesis at Butler, I went to Indiana Wesleyan first to finish my bachelor's degree, so I was immediately exposed to a wider, the evangelical Wesleyan kind of thing. They were while I was there, the big Asbury revival of 1970 occurred, that, much bigger than the one that happened last year, but it spread to Indiana Wesleyan, and there was this big revival, kids in the chapel 24/7 and so forth. And so I was in classes with a lot of those students, but I got ready to do my master's and went to Butler because Cecil had done his master's there. And I don't know if you know the book W.W. Odie, Contender for the Faith. That was sitting on the shelf right behind you there. That was his master's thesis at Butler. So I thought, I'll do the same thing. And because my dad had access to records from the old North Indianapolis Church, my granddad was an elder, my dad became an elder, and so he said, if you want these old records to use for your thesis, here they are. And so then Butler had a complete run of the American Christian Review, Octographic Review. Sommer changed the name several times, so I had access to that. I got into the correspondence that he had with Frederick D. Kirshner, which was in some ways a kind of an eye-opening thing for me. Sommer, despite his extreme conservatism that many people acknowledge, was a very open man as far as who he would go talk to. Frederick Kirshner, who was, and again, your audience may not know this, so I need to set the backstory here a little bit. Fred Kirshner was a J.W. McGarvey student at the College of the Bible, who in the maybe around the turn of the century, went to Princeton for his master's, wanted to go to Harvard, instead went to Europe for a year, but he becomes the youngest college president in the country at that time when he becomes president at what is TCU, now Texas Christian University, goes to Drake in Des Moines, comes to Butler as head of the Butler School of Religion. And he's a big person in the development of the Christian churches, served as an editor both for the Christian Evangelist, which was a disciple paper in St. Louis, and the Christian Standard, which was the more conservative North American Christian Convention-oriented paper in Cincinnati. So he's straddling this division that's occurring in the Christian churches in the 1920s and 30s. So when he comes to Butler, he establishes the Butler Midsummer Institute, which was a kind of a lectureship that had a lot of different people outside them. A.T. Robertson came up from Louisville, from Southern Baptist, to lecture in Greek. They had a lot of different people, but Kirshner reaches out to Daniel Sommer. And he says, I've been reading the review, and I'm refreshed by the candor and the honesty of it, which were polite terms. And Sommer could be very blunt, as you know. But Kirshner's like, I'm okay with that. So why don't you come over and speak on our Midsummer Institute? And Sommer began to do that. That opened up doors for him to go to Baltimore.
Who was he speaking opposite of?
So on several occasions, and I don't remember exactly, they were mostly disciples. He spoke on the war question one year, not necessarily anything that would be issues of that we think of as traditional issues between churches of Christ and Christian churches. But of course, the war question, the conscientious objector question, is something that would cut both directions in both groups. I mean, you'd have people who would disagree about the instrument in both camps who would then turn around and agree on could you serve in the military or not. So he did several things, but the really amazing thing is he goes to Baltimore and spends a week with Peter Ainsley, who is this big ecumenical disciple. And this is at a time when the whole rebaptism question is not just, can you use an instrument, but do you need to be baptized in order to be a Christian? Or the open membership question, can a church take in someone from a Presbyterian Methodist denominational church that has been sprinkled or whatever, and we'll just take them in and recognize them as a member. So he'll go anywhere. And what happens as a result of that is Sommer turns around from his left to his right and says, let me start a conversation with people that I've been estranged from, including Armstrong and others at Harding and these other places. So he takes on a couple of missionary journeys. The first one, which I think was in 1932, maybe. He goes to Louisville and talks with the premillennial brethren there, talks with Bull and Don Carlos Janes and Yale Jorgensen. He goes to Nashville and sits down and writes a letter back home to his children on Lipscomb stationery saying, who'd have thunk it? Here I am in the president's office at this college writing that. He goes to Abilene, goes to the lectures there. He goes to Bull's home and visits with the people at the orphanage there. And basically, I think he was sold a bill of goods by some of the college presidents who convinced him that we don't really take church, we're not advocating church support events. They're backing away from the Armstrong idea.
Okay.
This is an individually supported thing. We don't take church contributions. We don't demand churches to do that. Well, the fact is, as W.W. Odie said later, they all do it and they all deny it. And in the 60s, you may be familiar with how Lipscomb put out this big thing where they went back in their ledger books to 1891, to the very beginning, and showed that churches had always been taking contributions from that. Yeah. In the thesis, I talk about some correspondence I had with the gentleman who was the bursar at Henderson, And he said, was the song leader for N.B. Hardeman when Hardeman would go out for his meetings. And he said it was just understood that if you had Brother Hardeman for a meeting, on the closing night of the meeting, you were going to hear about the need for the church to support the college, and the collection would be taken. So, but Sommer is kind of convinced by these college presidents that they don't endorse Armstrong's idea. And so Sommer comes back and says, you know, as long as it's left on an individual basis, I don't really have a problem with that. And that, then there's this whole thing that kicks up with the rough draft for Christian unity, which was actually subtitled, Can't We Agree on Something?
Right.
and in which Sommer and some others in the review staff, his children and family, but others, W. Carl Ketcherside was a big Sommer protege, if you will. George Pepperdine grew up in a Sommerite church in Kansas before he goes out and founds Western Auto in California. And so Sommer says, as long as things are left on an individual basis, where I don't have to participate in them, I don't have to send money to a college, the church is not required to send money to a college, why can't we just leave it on that kind of individual basis? And I truly believe that if things had been left that way, and a lot of the push of demanding that churches support institutions, if that had been left on an individual basis, I think a lot of the division might have been avoided. I don't know. That's counterfactual history, but there you have it.
That was, if that's what Alan Heyer said. If we could have just left it at an individual, he said, I think it would have been a lot different. But one thing I want to talk about Daniel Sommer is I want to have a discussion about controversy.
Okay.
And you had this quote, and you said, one who can understand Daniel Sommer has taken a major step in understanding the religious psychology generally and the churches of Christ in particular. And so what level of studying his controversy would say this is a big step in understanding history amongst churches of Christ?
Yeah, we don't do controversy well, in my opinion. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I'm not sure I can give a short answer to your question. I did a lecture at Florida College in '82, so 40 years and some ago, in which I talked about controversy. That was the title of the lecture, as a matter of fact. So if you want a long answer to the question, go read that. And what I did was to say that even on you have categories of things that are major. They divide churches everywhere because they demand participation. The instrument, the support of a missionary society. Now, you could make Alan Heyer's argument about the orphanage, about the missionary society. I could just not give, or give my contribution somewhere else. But it does demand joint participation, or it does demand that I not participate collectively in that affair of the congregation. Or it might be, some other things. Could we support the Red Cross? Those kinds of issues. They're going to be divisive because they demand joint participation. The communion cup. I mean, the reason the One Cup brothers cannot participate is because they see that as a biblical mandate that prevents them, and because it's not a kind of thing where you can either do it or you can't do it. On the other hand, you have a lot of individual issues, everything from, can I play poker? Can I play rook if I can't play poker? Can I wear shorts? I'm violating my own rule here. Let me turn this. Well, I need it for my notes, so excuse my interruption. Every individual kind of activity you can think of. If you think it's wrong to observe Christmas or put up a Christmas tree or lights on your house, I can worship with you, even though I may think it's okay to do that. Now, I might decide to forbear that in order to have better fellowship with you, but it doesn't demand that I do the same sort of thing. So I had these kind of two buckets of issues, if you will. Well, then there are some sort of middle ground issues that I think are not necessarily joint participation, but they involve serious moral and doctrinal issues: abortion, marriage, divorce, and remarriage. I mean, if a sister in the congregation has an abortion, that doesn't mean that I have to endorse it. Or, obviously I'm not going to have an abortion, but it is a serious issue that I think raises some fellowship questions. So I don't have all the answers to that, but I think generally we have sometimes tended to confuse the level of vociferous, the way in which we address them by saying, I can't have fellowship with you if you don't agree with me on this issue, that issue, or some other issue. And, you know, and where I go to speak or somewhere. And that's actually a question I would like to raise with you at some point in the discussion, because I have an impression that you and your father maybe have issues with who speaks on a lectureship somewhere. Mm-hmm. And that relates to Sommer, because the thing that I learned from him early on was, as he said, I will go anywhere on God's footstool to preach the gospel or to say what I think needs to be said, be it a Romish cathedral or a courthouse or a lager beer saloon. And that was very influential with me as a young man. I agree with Alan Hires on this point, and a lot of points, but I'll go to Pepperdine and speak, and I have. I'll go to Abilene or appear on the Texas Normal Singing School. I'll go to Lipscomb and be on the Christian Scholars Conference, though I have to admit that when they put who was the what the Washington Post called the foul-mouthed lesbian Lutheran preacher. I can't think of her name right now, but I'm like, I don't want to be on that. And I was not on a program with that. So there are some ways in which I wouldn't want my name to appear on a program with somebody that's outrageous, but I'll go virtually anywhere to speak if they'll give me the freedom to say what I think needs to be said. And I think I learned that lesson pretty early on from Daniel Sommer, who, when he got where he was going, would say very frankly what he thought that audience needed to hear. And you've probably read Kirshner's obituary, which I put as an appendix in the thesis, in which he said that very thing, that Sommer was considered by most people not only on the right wing, but the very tip of the wing. And yet there was never a more fair-minded man who would treat others with respect, even when he disagreed with them. And Kirshner was very appreciative of Sommer coming to appear on the conference when he tried to get Foy Wallace Jr., he tried to get all of the big names in the mainstream Churches of Christ to come up and be on the Midsummer Institute. No, they wouldn't do it. They're not going to have fellowship with these Christian church guys.
Well, the statement from Sommer that I'll go here and there if I'm given the liberty, I don't disagree with that.
Yeah.
My problem is when the men who are appealing to such a quote, they don't speak against anything.
Yeah.
And so that was what I brought up to Alan Hires about Bruce McClarty. Bruce McClarty is just on the pulpit with a load of women preachers.
Okay.
And we're not saying anything about it.
Yeah.
And so I would make a note to the Sand Creek Address in 1889. I mean, that was a moment where there's discrepancy, but you think there was 5,000 to 6,000 people there?
Probably so. I mean, I don't have any reason to doubt the number.
Do.
Well, it's kind of like the Cane Ridge meeting. I mean, there are lots of estimates on that and so forth. But clearly it was an important meeting. I mean, there were thousands of people there, whether it was 5 or 6 or 3 or 4, whatever.
And I would basically take that as a point of looking at his history and applying it, bringing it over to today. Is he had an audience of 5,000 to 6,000 people, and he basically gave a list of these are the things that are dividing us, and we need some action on it. Mm-hmm. And I look at him. How long had he been the editor of the Review? Can you?
He became the editor in 1886 is when he bought it, and so this was, and again, that was precipitated by the same kind of thing that I think Alan maybe doesn't say much about, and there was this huge push for let's introduce the instrument in all of these churches. I mean, that was what was dividing it. And not only that, Sommer was a witness in a number of church trials in the 1890s and early 20th century where Christian churches were suing for possession of the building that had sometimes been built by the people who were opposing the instrument. And Sommer actually had a pretty good track record in trial. Most of the trials he appeared in were decided, including one that went to the Illinois Supreme Court. I think I put the decision also in an appendix in the thesis. But let me just, and I don't want to be pejorative, but I am curious about this, just between you and me. You mentioned Bruce McClarty, who I know is a fairly conservative guy in the institutional movement. I've done 2 or 3 tours on the Harding bus for people that are mostly Harding people doing restoration history, where I usually joined them at Nashville, but we do all the Nashville sites, go up into Kentucky, do all the Kentucky restoration sites, going up to Bethany, and Bruce and they were both, his wife were on one. So does that mean I'm fellowshipping Bruce, who's fellowshipping women preachers? I mean, is that your viewpoint? Or
I find it counterproductive.
Okay.
You have in one of your notes, I think it was probably in 2017, you referenced that Thomas Warren and a collection of those men put together called a document of concern.
Yeah, an expression of concern.
Expression of concern, and in that they brought up exactly what I would be saying is the fellowship with individuals who are on the fence.
Okay.
I don't count Bruce as sound.
I see. Okay.
I think he is, while he's on the fence and he's over here at Pepperdine, we know a handful of people that when they see Bruce McClarty at Pepperdine, they say, oh, Pepperdine must be moving in the right direction. And they're not.
Yeah.
And I think it's just the appearance of it. And always what gets brought down to me, and so this would be moving into Wallace and BC Goodpasture, is there's public action and then there's backroom conversation.
Yes.
And so what I keep finding is conflicting actions with backroom conversations that no one gets to hear.
Okay.
And so it would be things like when Alan Hires takes up for Bruce McClarty based on backroom conversations. But what I see in the open is him sharing the pulpit with Amy McLaughlin Sheesby, who's a woman preacher on staff at Abilene.
Yeah. And it's an interesting question. I mean, we just had John Mark Hicks to be on an electronic forum. We do a monthly preachers study here in the tri-state area that attracts, used to be, before COVID, it was in person. We met at Joliet, which is kind of a central place, but guys from Indiana, Wisconsin, Illinois would come. We went online, a Zoom meeting during COVID, and we attracted people from all over the place, so we've left it that way. So we looked at John Mark's book, I think in the March meeting, and I said, why don't we have him come and be on the April meeting? So we just had him, and I just had done an article in Truth Magazine a month or so before we did an issue on progressive Christianity, and I reviewed his book as much as you can in 1,500 words. But I don't view that as me having, I mean, it's a level of fellowship. I mean, we're participating in discussion,
Right.
but we're clearly disagreeing with each other. And, you know, when I was on the bus with Brother McClarty and a lot of other people, including some other faculty from Harding, and we picked up some from Lipscomb, I'm frankly talking about, you know, Daniel Sommer and that controversy, and I'm talking about the institutional controversy and what happened. We go back when we were in Pennsylvania and West Virginia and talk about the Campbell controversy. So it's not like I'm pulling punches
Right.
or not stating what my convictions are.
And so can I say too, I don't want to create a room where no conversation is had.
Okay.
My issue is the conversations of division are not happening in the open.
Okay.
And so that's usually what people will say back to me is they'll say, well, you don't know what he said. And my thought is, yeah, I do. I listened to the lesson.
Okay.
He didn't say anything out there.
See, I'm so unplugged from the going back to Alan's point about we don't know each other.
Right.
I mean, I know I've got some data points and so forth, but I can't always connect the dots about who's talking with who or who's saying what or who's on this program or, you know, I'm a stranger to that.
Okay. Well, we're at the point, and that's, you know, good that you said that. We're at the point, you had another quote. It's either in 88 or 2017. You quoted you didn't say his name. That's irrelevant. But he was a student at Lipscomb.
Okay.
And he had been a student at Harding Graduate. And when he finished, he referencing conservative mainliners, he said, these people have to divide. Do you remember that quote?
Yes, I do.
He said, there's no way that they can keep working. So I agree with that quote.
Yeah, I do too.
And it's gotten worse. Like the instrumental music question, you basically have folk giving lip service to instrumental music at this point.
Yeah.
And so this is just for, you know, you said you don't know where we are.
Yeah.
So it's crazy right now that in 2023, would you have thought they got to this point? There were 4 Pepperdine speakers on the Freed-Hardeman lectureship?
At this point, I would not be surprised at how far or how fast anything is moving.
But isn't that surprising?
Well, not really to a historian, because it's a repetitive kind of thing that happens over and over again. And I should say, I don't know if you've seen, I just did, just a few months ago, it just came out, L.A. Stouffer had a book on Restoration history. L.A. was, as a longtime friend of mine, preaches in St. Louis. And the publisher asked me to write, he's up in years now, would you write a couple of addendum chapters to this to bring the story up into the 21st century? So I did, and I document what I could find of the instrumental women preacher kind of thing. I don't know if you've seen that work or not, but I've got quite a few references, so I'm aware to some degree of what's going on, but I'm just not plugged in enough to that universe to know everything that's going on like I'm sure you do.
It's substantially worse.
Okay.
Than I would say from 2000 or from 88, 90, substantially worse. We were talking to the elder, Mr. Jerry, before you got in here. We don't have fellowship, and I'm using that in the same way I believe that you would. It's an Ed Harrell quote. I can only determine who I work and worship with.
Exactly.
So as far as work and worship go, there's going to be very, very few people inside the main line.
Okay.
And can I tell you, I don't view myself as partyistic to that.
Yeah.
We're calling this stuff out and getting, just, there's a note here from Russell Arrett said about Daniel Sommer, don't let him in the building. Don't let him use your pulpit. Yeah. It's being told to us by students at different schools of preaching that the directors are saying, if you see him coming, lock the door.
Huh. Okay.
So I'm not a member of their party.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate that. And I think Ed Harrell's controversial thing that he wrote, not of his historical things, is this tract called The Emergence of the Church of Christ Denomination.
Yes.
And I think that is entirely correct.
Yes.
I know you've seen it and got it. I mean, the mainstream churches of Christ seem to me to have, they exhibit a lot of denominational characteristics.
They do.
And again, stealing a page from Ed's notebook, what doesn't surprise me about this is if you look at the 19th century division, which many people see as a two-way division, instrumental, non-instrumental, missionary society, actually there was a three-way division. You get the progressive wing breaking off in, let's say, the 1890s, as I talked about. But then within a generation, say 30 years later, by 1927, there's enough friction in that group that agreed on the instrument, agreed on the missionary society, that they broke off and the North American Christian Convention begins in 1927. They have their own preacher list, they have their own annual meeting. This was what Kirshner was trying to straddle, this increasing divide in the 20s and 30s. My grandfather, to go back to my family history, was the financial secretary for what is now E91, the big mega church in the Christian churches in Indianapolis. But he left in the 1930s because he could see that drift that way, and he heard E.G. Creasy preach on the radio. A Kentucky preacher came up to Indianapolis, and they started meeting in the Red Man's Hall out on Michigan Street, and my granddad said to my dad, we haven't heard preaching like that since we left the farm. He went in the Navy in World War I, came home, left the farm, came to Indianapolis and worked in some of the industries there. So that division then I think is remirrored in the 1950s division. You had the predominant majority, 90%, 85%, whatever the number actually is. I mean, you can count it better in the 1890s division because you have the census. So you have about 15%, 12 or 15% of the congregations that are anti-instrumental, anti-missionary society. But they tend to grow over the long term because they're very evangelistic, while the majority, the 85, 90%, now split in half between the progressives, what became the disciples, an avowed denomination who's openly saying, well, yeah, we look like a denomination, we talk like a denomination, we quack like a denomination.
Because we are
We're probably a denomination, and are very open about it and want to participate in the ecumenical movement with other denominations. Well, that replicates itself, and I've talked to some institutional historian guys, they don't like this. They don't buy totally Ed's idea, which I think is crystal clear to anybody with eyes to see and ears to hear.
I say,
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's happening.
I thought you would, yes.
I don't disagree.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I came to talk to you, is because everybody is looking at like the 1800s and they say, oh, here it is, plain as day. And now I'm starting to talk to people and they're saying back in the 1960s, there it is, plain as day. Yeah. Well, I'm still very much active in mainline, and I'm saying we are at 1890, 1960 again.
I would not be surprised. I mean, I'm not disputing that. That's
Right.
why I said, I think your dad was kind of smiling at me off camera here, but I'm not surprised to know from you or from some other people that I do talk to. And in fact, I'll be quite honest, I see a generation out from the anti-controversy. I see, as we get new generations of people that are preaching some of the same. It's not always as clear when you're in the early stages, but I think given another generation or two, it's Judges 2 all over again. I mean, it's the generation that arose that did, to them, Moses was just a guy. I mean, they didn't know him from Adam. Literally, they would not know the difference between Adam and Moses.
Yes.
And then there's that, there were some of them, the second generation, who had heard about Moses and maybe even knew him when they were young and he was old, but they didn't really grasp, to go back to your childhood memory thing, they didn't really quite grasp what was going on. Then you get that third generation, they know nothing about the kind of struggles that their grandparents went through, or what made it important for their grandparents to separate from the nations round about them. And I think it's that same principle. You just see it all over the place, and not just in churches of Christ. I mean, you can do this in Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist.
Well, where I am, and I will, these people that I'll talk to are not nearly as serious as you are, but they'll start talking about the history, and then they'll say, there's nothing you can do about it. I don't buy that.
Yeah.
And so I'll ask a question now. Do you think that the division from the Christian church would have been what it is without Daniel Sommer's controversy? And so can I put a quote from you in here? One time you said about, as a historian, the goal is to always be objective. Yeah. And then you said, but I'm going to be honest with y'all, I get tired of that. do you remember that?
I don't, but I'm not surprised that I might have said something like that.
So I'm here, like I want your 2 cents.
Yeah.
I want you to give me what you think about history, not just what happened.
Okay, yeah.
Do you think that the break with the Christian church would have been what it is if it were not for Daniel Sommer in 1889?
I think if not for Daniel Sommer or somebody like him, I mean, I don't subscribe to a kind of great man theory of history where I do think individuals can make a difference. But I think if it hadn't been Sommer, somebody else would have stepped into the breach and said, Sam, there were other people who were saying the same thing. Just Sommer had a paper, so he could spill barrels of ink to say what he said. So clearly he had an influence, and I think it was a good influence. I'm glad that he said what he said, even though he could sometimes be pretty brusque, and he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. So I don't know if that's a good answer to your question.
Well, you're saying if it wasn't him, it would be someone else.
Yeah.
And in order to do it, would they have had to have been equally controversial?
Probably so. And I do think there is an inevitability, as I said, to these divisions. Yes. I think it's going to happen. I wouldn't say no matter what necessarily, because I think that the word is powerful, and the more we can preach and proclaim, the more people you can reclaim in a kind of a remnant. But I think the truth is always going to be a minority position. I don't think the truth is popular with the majority. It wasn't when the Lord was on earth. It wasn't when the apostles were preaching. And I am not greater than my master. I'm not better than an apostle. So,
and that's I'm not shooting for something like where I say, we're going to create this massive remnant, and I'm going to be elected president. I'm just saying I have to try to do the best that I can do. And as I look back, I do think that's what these people were doing. So you said if it weren't him, it would have been someone else. Your 2 cents. David Lipscomb, in a personal letter to Daniel Sommer, just frankly said, you turned me off.
Yeah.
And then he said publicly in his paper, he publicly said, at the moment, I would not be able to work with him given his present style.
Yeah.
So, is there any value to these conversations where one person says, I agree with what you said, I just didn't like how you said it?
Yeah. Well, I have that feeling about a number of people. I won't name any names. And I do think it's a kind of a Paul Barnabas sort of thing. I mean, Paul and Barnabas got to a place where they had a serious disagreement, and they didn't start the Circumcision Chronicle and the Jerusalem Gazette as rival papers to tear each other apart.
Right.
They took other people and went to different places and worked together. And I think the New Testament indicates that John Mark is useful to me for service. Another example, Paul's like, get rid of this guy. I'm not working with him. So I do think that there are different styles, and sometimes we might not be able to work together. I probably rub I rub some people the wrong way. I mean, I do. And I don't want to do that. I don't intend to do that, but it's just a fact. Mm-hmm. You may do the same thing. I don't know. There are just some people that are not going to listen to me. Maybe they'll listen to you. Maybe they'll listen to one of my students instead. Maybe one of my students has a better attitude or a better people style, or maybe he appeals to a certain kind of people who wouldn't cross the street to hear me preach, mm-hmm. Either because my style's bad or sometimes they've heard that my style is abrasive. They don't really know that, but somebody's told them, like you were saying, lock the door when you see this guy coming. Sometimes that happens.
So going from 1889 to basically 1906 in the census, this would just be your personal note. Do you view David Lipscomb as just dragging his feet?
I think Lipscomb came more to appreciate Sommer's view when he was sort of had his nose rubbed in it. Mm. When he confronts the same kind of things with legal trials and people trying to take the building away that Sommer had been maybe a decade before. So Sommer, I think in many ways, I think Lipscomb liked Daniel Sommer. I don't think he had the same style, but I think on one level, I mean, even going back, Lipscomb liked, Isaac Errett. Mm-hmm. I think he saw Errett, and Errett was in many ways a true conservative. He had some tendencies that took him away from the kind of conservatism that both Lipscomb and Sommer had. But I think at some point, had Lipscomb lived longer, I think he might have gotten to be more appreciative of Daniel Sommer.
Do you remember the quote, what's the commonality between the people on the left and the right?
I don't. Refresh my memory.
They dislike the people in the middle. And so when I look back, I don't want it to be either that I don't like anybody unless they're identical to me. Yeah. No, I like reading Isaac Errett material, and then I like reading Daniel Sommer material. I just get frustrated reading David Lipscomb material. Yeah.
I mean, I get frustrated reading both of them. I don't. There are things about both of them that I don't care for. I'll add one other thing, that while I was working with the Sommer material and coming to appreciate some of his viewpoints more, at least his approach to being open to talk to anybody. I mentioned being at Indiana Wesleyan. I went to Southern Baptist Seminary when I was in Louisville, and I should probably say, you've got a note on here, the last point, my personal career and work. Yeah. That's not important, except it maybe does shed some light. I've never moved anywhere to go to school. I mean, I've always been a preacher in one way. That's my baseline, although I've done some other things in radio and television or teaching in university. But I would always take advantage of educational opportunities where I was. So in Atlanta, that meant Emory. In Nashville, that's Vanderbilt. In Louisville, it's the Southern Baptist Seminary, which at that time, that was pre-takeover. That was before the conservatives began to take over the convention and then the seminaries, pre-Al Mohler days. Mm-hmm. But I developed friendships and an appreciation on one level for people who take the Bible seriously. And we may disagree about a number of particular issues. I thought, for example, you referred to Don Carson's review of Rubel's book, which I thought pretty well took the hide off in some ways that exposed some of the weaknesses. I mean, when you say, well, I'm not a historian, well, why are you trying to speak authoritatively about history if you're not? Not that people can't talk about history, but I thought Carson's review in many ways was straight to the point, but it gave me an appreciation for people that then I think helped me when I got into secular universities at Vanderbilt and UK, and even Butler before that, where my faith is being challenged in a lot of ways, but I can respect either the integrity of somebody who I think has conviction and belief, as opposed to somebody who's just making an argument, or who has a position to maintain, or they're trying to keep up a facade of this is my group and I'm going to maintain the group identity regardless of whether there's any intellectual support for it or not. So I think that was useful for me to go through that experience and not be educated in COC schools in some ways. I think that was a valuable experience for me.
And with that, so as we're talking about the history, there are people that I can talk to, and I don't call them dishonest. We're just disagreeing.
Yeah.
Sometimes I might say that they don't know as much as they ought to,
Yeah.
and they're making a bad decision.
Yeah.
But as I do look at history, I do think that there is a lot of filthy lucre.
Okay.
And I do, and I basically say that with the institutions, and so what I mean by that is, did you read L.C. Sears' biography of James A. Harding?
Years and years ago, yes.
Well,
I
they
did.
were all like the way, and he was a president, so he was saying in the history, like, everybody was being promised positions and meetings, and so I think that's heavily in there. Like, if someone asks me, well, don't you think that a lot of these people are honest? I do.
Yes.
But I also think that there's so much money going around that is hard to weigh with my honesty.
The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil.
Yes.
And institutions have budgets and need financial support.
Yeah.
And when you get a lot of them with their hands out and not only begging churches, but in some ways demanding that it is your obligation, your salvation might depend on it, that's when you begin to get to a flashpoint that's going to cause division. And the pride that you mentioned, the sort of feeding the ego of, can I hold more meetings? Can I get this position? Can I hold this chair? Can I become the president of this and that, or something else? I think my wife, who's a board-certified psychologist, says more Christians, and particularly preachers, may be lost because of pride than all of the other sins put together. And she may very well be right about that.
And I think there are things like that, and not to be dismissive of doctrine, but I mean, I've had one person just basically reduce it down to stop signs, and they put me in hell over stop signs, and I just said, if I'm going to hell, it's going to be something bigger than these stop signs. So, but with some of this and the history repeating itself, can we talk about Foy Wallace, B.C. Goodpasture? I found this on your Facebook.
Okay.
But it came from Florida College. It came from Ed Harrell. There's always these connections too. That this is why I say I don't think we can dismiss our commonalities.
Mm-hmm.
When you're looking at the Gospel Advocate, and if someone says, I don't like Foy Wallace, when you get into the Foy Wallace B.C. Goodpasture conversation, both of them were editors at the Gospel Advocate.
Yes.
So there's always going to be this passing each other that just, as far as the history goes, we have to acknowledge.
Yeah.
So moving from Foy, the quote is, Foy Wallace scourged heretics, and B.C. Goodpasture just marginalizing.
He promised them they would lose their place in the Brotherhood.
Yes.
That was Ed Harrell. He did a lecture at FC about mid-'80s probably, where he talked about Goodpasture. Of course, he knew B.C. Goodpasture. His son, Clad, I think, was Ed's roommate at Lipscomb and best man in their wedding. So he knew him personally. I actually talked to Brother Goodpasture when I was a grad student at Vanderbilt. This was 20 years later. Very congenial gentleman. Loved to go into his little book. He had places out, little sheds out behind his house that had books stacked up everywhere, and just all over the floor, like you were talking about. And but I think there was that distinction. Wallace was not above scorching a heretic if he thought somebody was teaching something unbiblical, particularly if he was promoting it and trying to convert other people to his viewpoint. Wallace would, man, he'd come down on him. Good Pastor had an entirely different kind of approach. It was a managerial style. I think that is a correct analysis, yes.
And so what I asked earlier about, if it weren't for Daniel Sommer, Sand Creek Address, making that press, would the break from the Christian church, would it have been what it is? And you said, if not him, someone else. So in the 1930s, the premillennial controversy, most people don't know now that premillennialism was a big thing in the congregations of the body of Christ. And Foy Wallace scorched the heretics.
Yeah, he did.
Would it have been moved out the way that it was if it weren't for Foy Wallace?
Well, it's hard to answer because it is counterfactual history, so who can say? But if Wallace certainly was the kind of flashpoint, the point man, if you will. But there were a lot of other people. I think that's the thing to lose sight of, is you can have a representative man who's widely known because he's the editor of a paper or because he holds a lot of meetings or whatever. But for every guy like that, there are guys in local congregations who are fighting the good fight, if you will, scorching heretics at their own level or teaching the truth about something. Now, they may be using material they got out of one of Foy's debates or out of his music hall lessons that Roy Cogdell published. So I think that the answer is a little bit of both, that yes, I don't subscribe to a great man theory of history, but I do think individuals can step up and become kind of flashpoints that both reflect and obscure the fact that there are thousands of other people who are doing the same thing. They're just not doing it with the same publicity.
And I wouldn't take away from those individuals.
No.
But I think, and they're doing their part and they're doing it well. But I do think what we're essentially saying is there will always be 7,000 people that don't bow their knee, but there is only going to be one Elijah.
Well, yes, I think that's a good analogy.
And so would you call
that's
Foy Wallace
balance.
in that scene? He had to play the role of Elijah.
Yeah, clearly. And he, the other thing was Foy seemed to relish the role.
Yeah.
I don't know that Elijah ran for prophet, but by all accounts, Foy was. I heard Foy Wallace preach actually when I was a kid, about right after we moved to Emerson Avenue. This would have been 1959 or 60. Terry Gardner gave me the date one time. He went back and looked it up. Of course, he is the guy you need to talk to about Foy Wallace Jr. But what I remember about it was, as a kid, is that Wallace had this elegant senatorial appearance, shock of white hair, three-piece, vested suit, watch fob, and he looked like a U.S. senator ought to look like. But what I remember is he preached that Sunday morning for probably until nearly 1 o'clock. And you could almost see the steam rising off of the sisters, because in a day before oven timers, you would put your roast in the oven before you went to church, thinking you're going to be back home by noon or 12:30. You don't get home until an hour later, and all these roasts are burning to a crisp all over Indianapolis. And I do remember he got up that night and fervently apologized for it.
Yeah.
And then preached for an hour and something. He just could not help himself, I think. But he did kind of relish the limelight, if you will.
Well, these are points of history that I think will have to be replayed, and so I'll say this now. There will be people that basically, as they hear this conversation, me and you and I've made these points, they're going to say, Caleb thinks he's going to be Foy Wallace. I am happy for someone else to rise up and do what needs to be done. The problem is we are getting so many people, and I would say this about, here's some notes more about the quote. It was between the differences between Wallace and Good Pasture.
Okay.
We went from truth-oriented to group-oriented.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not in a group.
Yeah.
Like, I'm in the universal body of Christ, so I can't very well play the group game. We went from open controversy to closed controversy, and I would say I'm in that difference right now. Anytime I raise a flag about something, I basically have a collection of these Brotherhood leaders that say, we're going to talk about it. No one ever hears about it.
So keep the peace. Don't talk about the issue.
Right.
Basically.
So can I give a point of reference? Like
Sure.
you said, you haven't kept up with what they're doing. In the time frame of like the late 80s and the 90s, Ed Harrell and Mike Willis had that discussion right in the middle
Yes.
of the lectures.
Yeah.
And they were debating about the marriage and divorce view. They had that discussion.
Yeah.
There's no way that would happen right now.
Really?
They are not going to do anything close to that at Freed Hardeman or even. Do you think, as your remembrance, was Memphis militant?
Was Memphis militant?
Yes, sir.
I don't know that much. You mean the Memphis School of Preaching?
Yes,
See,
sir.
I know virtually nothing about Memphis
Well,
School. I mean, I learned a lot listening to Alan talk about it. but-
Okay. Well, you brought in a moment ago the Stone Campbell Encyclopedia.
Yes.
That's their note. Whoever it was that made the note for the Memphis School of Preaching, they said they were the most militant school.
Okay.
They would not do what Ed Harrell and Mike Willis did. So
Interesting.
there is no open controversy. It's all closed controversy. Self-conscious.
I'll tell you just one thing that your comment triggered. I had lunch with Alan Hires. He may not remember this, but no, at Freed Hardeman. I used to go to Freed Hardeman a lot to lectures. What happened was that Florida College in the 90s, the first time the Super Bowl was played in Tampa,
Okay.
they had to move the lectures to the first week of February because all the hotels were taken for the Super Bowl. And people kind of got to liking that first week of February, so they just left it year. That was the week that conflicted with Freed Hardeman's lectures. So I then had to make a choice, and some years I went to one and not the other, but generally I would go to Florida. But I offered to Alan, I said, this would have been about late 90s, maybe 2000, something, maybe early 21st century. I said, if I could, not that I'm a big shot, and I said, I don't know that I could do this, but if I could get a slot on the Florida College lectures for you or somebody of your choosing to come and say whatever you want to say, and could you get a slot on the Freed Hardeman lectures for either me or somebody of my choosing
Yes.
to come and say what we thought needed to be said? And his response was, I think if I went over to the Bible department and made that offer, they would not know what I was talking about. They would not have any idea about the institutional controversy. Now, I don't totally buy that, but Alan's in a position to know better than I am what's going on, because
I believe it.
I know there are people there who, well, so anyway, I'll take your word for it.
Okay.
By the way, I asked Alan, I'll make the same offer for you to come to the Truth Lectures. I mean, I do the open forum there, and we'd be happy to have you come. But would you get me on the Spiritual Sword Lectures or something commensurate to that?
And what you're describing, that's what I think ought to happen. But usually it's just one-sided.
Yeah.
We're going to invite this person. They believe in women preachers. No conversation.
Okay.
And it's not a thing of, can I come over there and talk about why I don't believe that's okay? No.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where the mainline institutional is right now. It's all one-sided, and it's pointed towards progressive liberals.
Yeah. I can see that. And what you're feeling is probably what a lot of antis felt in the 1950s when they were basically shut out of the Brotherhood institutions and told you're not welcome here and go play in the traffic. So I get it, yes.
I'm sure. One of the things, as we talked about history repeating itself, I do want to get your take on this, though. So when B.C. Goodpasture, and I think it's irrelevant who came up with quarantine, someone wrote into the Advocate and said, why don't we quarantine these folk? Yeah. And then B.C. basically said that's a good idea. And so my question, though, is, and the stuff that I've read, is what B.C. Goodpasture did with the yellow tag of quarantine, wasn't that just recycled from Foy Wallace? What he did to premillennialists?
Well, maybe so. I had not thought of it in that regard, but yeah, that might be right. And if maybe that's what sets Sommer apart from it. It's one thing to say, I'm going to tell you why you're a heretic. It's another thing to say, I'm not even going to have a conversation with you. So I hadn't really kind of made that connection. But yeah, in some ways, Wallace was, I think, not necessarily open to hearing. And I don't know that much. And Terry's a guy you need to talk to about that. Wallace certainly would go debate one of them and do it, one church to another church. Equal time in each place. I think. Let me think about that for a minute. I don't know. It's something I would need to chew on for a while.
Okay. Well, another one I basically thought Daniel Sommer was saying about the legal battles. He was advocating to put it in the deed, that this would not be a place that used instrumental music.
Yeah.
And again, as I said, BC Good Pasture and Recycling, BC and the Advocate had a note of putting it in the deed.
Yeah.
If this congregation doesn't support the home, the orphan home.
Yeah.
And so, again, did BC not just recycle Daniel Sommer?
Yeah, he probably did, and I wouldn't be in favor of the creed in the deed idea. Whoever said it, whether it was Sommer or Good Pasture, right. I don't think that's a good idea, personally.
Okay, and so I don't like creeds, and I don't like it's the idea of you do X, Y, Z, you're a Church of Christ, So, but the idea of the legal battles. What do you do? Like if they're out to get the building and we think they're wrong.
I would rather suffer the wrong, let them take the building, than to go through a big legal squabble.
Okay. One of the things too that's to note, the building at Sand Creek was nothing to fight about.
Well, not by our standards, no.
Right?
But by the standards of the day, to have a brick building like that out in a rural area, that was something, and it said something about the value that people placed on the assembly. And this probably gets us into the whole discussion about church buildings and the use of church buildings.
Right.
But I just can't see that it's worth not only lawsuits, but the Expressway Church in Louisville, which is where I preached in Louisville, was born out of the Taylor Boulevard controversy, in which there were not only lawsuits that were paraded across the papers of the daily newspapers, morning and evening, back in the day when you had two different newspapers, and you get occasionally on the front page, or in the business section, church fights and squabbles, and I mean literally fisticuffs in the lobby. Mm-hmm. One of the elders told me he was smaller, not a large man, but said I was pushed around between four large brothers, just like I was a football.
Right.
My father-in-law, in another context in Middle Tennessee, was struck by an elder with a closed fist, and thugs were hired one Sunday night to rough him up, and some of the brothers formed a cordon around him and walked him to his car. I mean, those kinds of things. Is it really worth having that kind of an argument over brick and mortar? I guess that's my take on it. And I understand how people, if you invested in a building and it represents something it's a symbol of what's important in your life, to let that symbol go to somebody that you see as doing the devil's work is a bitter pill to follow. But the fact is, in the instrument controversy or the institutional controversy, a lot of brethren just started over, and in some ways it energized the work.
Right. Well, I think it could, depending on who you're working with, could go both ways. I read a story, I don't remember what state they were in, but it was a congregation, they split, and I basically would say the right, in my opinion, the right side, they took the loss, like you said. They moved themselves to the bad side of town. They took a rundown former Pentecostal building, and the elder, he was an elder, and when they got in there, the elder said, "This is the happiest we've been in years." So,
my memory of Sommer's participation in that is that I don't know that he ever instigated a lawsuit. He would come in as a witness,
right,
and sometimes was subpoenaed as a witness, and to come in and say, here's what the Bible says, here's what this group in meeting in this building has believed for years, based on my experience holding meetings for them, and then let the judge decide who really has the right to the property. I wouldn't so much have trouble with that as, just aggressively, I'm going to keep you from getting this property.
Right.
But, Paul appealed to Caesar and let the government and the legal system take its course, and I think maybe there's a place for that. But, to aggressively put differences between brothers out in public, I don't know that that's
a
worthwhile objective.
I've heard people say, my daddy laid the brick here.
Yeah.
I don't care about that. And so I wouldn't advocate. Before we move off of Foy, I do want to make some quotes. On the note of Daniel Sommer, did he actually, this is going back a little bit, did Daniel Sommer get to have that talk with A.T. Robertson? he was invited.
I don't know the answer. They were on the same program.
Okay.
Whether they were able to speak to each other, I don't know.
Well, Kirshner invited A.T. Robertson was going to come up from Louisville and present why religious colleges, and he invited Sommer to do the negative.
Yeah.
And I want to put that in there because A.T. Robertson, obviously he's Baptist, and so a lot of folk won't know who that is. In about 2010, my dad debated on television with a Baptist PhD.
Okay.
And at some point in that debate, that man, the Baptist preacher, said, A.T. Robertson is the premier Greek scholar.
Oh.
So and my point of, let's not dismiss Daniel Sommer. I mean, he was in the room having serious conversations with serious people.
Yeah.
Earl West said that Daniel Sommer was more correct than his enemies ever gave him credit for.
Yeah.
And you said earlier you said David Lipscomb actually liked Daniel Sommer.
I think on one level he did. And
Well,
of course, the J.D. Tant quote that's in the thesis, I can't quote it exactly, but it's something like it was said that you were divisive or something, but I predict that as time goes on, the worth of what you were saying will become evident. Words to that effect.
J.D. Tant said we're going to look backwards and say a prophet was among us and we didn't know it.
Yeah.
But Daniel Sommer referred to those type of people. He said, these are my unfriendly friends.
Yes, I don't have any enemies. I have friendly friends and unfriendly friends, and I've tried to make that kind of my polar star when I'm being treated in a way that I don't consider particularly friendly.
Yes.
That quotation frequently floats to mind.
Well, I like that too. But my problem, I had one man. He was a Baptist, and he was in the music team on the Baptist church, and so I did some television broadcasts against instrumental music, and I used his Baptist church. And he said, I thought we were friends. And I said, we are friends. And I said, but if you're not going to give me the freedom to disagree, then I don't know that you know what a friend is. Yeah. Foy Wallace, for anybody who wants to dismiss him, I always have a hard time saying his name, Tillit S. Tedley.
Yeah.
Leroy Garrett visited with him, and Tillit would travel and lead songs for meetings. And Leroy Garrett asked Tillit, who do you think in all your song leading that you did and you traveled, who was the greatest preacher? And he said, without hesitation, it was Foy Wallace. And so I don't want anybody really to get villainized. Yeah. I don't want people that I disagree with say, they never did anything good and they hated their mama too. Yeah. It's just, but I want to be honest about where the positions are.
I understand that. Ted, brother, I have to tell you my favorite Tedley story that a lot of people hear it say that's the coolest story I've heard. I've made a hobby of going to cemeteries and photographing dead preachers' graves over the years. I mean, I've got a whole collection of slides going back 50 years. So I'm looking for Tillit S. Tedley's grave one year in Texas. I was spoke on restoration history at the FC camp at Thorpe Spring, on the campus of what's left of the old Thorpe Spring Christian College. And couldn't find it in the side. Somebody told me he was buried there. Well, I couldn't find his grave. So the next week, a friend of mine, Jamie Sloan, and his wife, Glenna, we go up. Somebody else said, I think he's buried up at Gunter, Texas. So we go hot July day, combing through the cemetery. Couldn't find it. There's a home for the aged that I think maybe the No Class brothers have there. So I go hiking into the front desk there thinking somebody will know. And I said to the woman at the desk, can you tell me where Tillit S. Tedley is buried? And she looks at me like I have lost my mind and says, buried? He's in room 106. And he was. Yeah. And so we went down there and he said, get up in that little chest of drawers over there. He's blind. He was about 98 or 9. He lived 104. He used to be on the Today Show, more than 100 thing that they do every day. But he said, get up in that little chest of drawer and get my hymn books out. He had bound 80 or 90 of his hymns together. And he said, turn to page, 67 or whatever. I'll sing the tenor. So we sat there and sang with Tillit S. Tedley for probably half an hour. Jamie sang the lead, Glenna alto. He sang the tenor, I sang the bass, and we just, he from memory. I mean, he'd call out a number and we'd, sing some of his hymns. So.
Well, his story about Foy, that is incredible, to be looking for a dead person. They're alive.
It's the job of a historian.
It's almost, I don't know what you get that age. I don't know if he would even say that was insulting. I can understand how you made that mistake. No, he said Foy Wallace, his favorite song was Glorified Millions Are Singing It Now.
Yes.
And Foy would get done preaching. Brother Tillett would get up, he'd sing it, and as people were responding, Foy would stop him, make another call, and then he'd say, "Keep on singing, Brother Tillett." And then on that same note too, I think I want to put this in there because people wouldn't expect it from this person. When Leroy Garrett told that Tillett said that, our greatest preacher, then Leroy Garrett also himself added, "Few have sacrificed more than Foy Wallace did for the cause." And so I think that people get dismissed for personality, and I'm not discounting that people have flaws.
Yeah. You know, like I say, you should talk to Terry Gardner about it, and not to defend any of Foy's flaws, but the thing, of course, that he gets hammered for today is his 1940 comments on racial issues, which, again, a point of contrast. I mean, Daniel Sommer was running integrated Bible studies, Bible readings, he called them, back into the 1870s in Pennsylvania. And I've got this photograph that I lent to Terry that he restored. It's been on my Facebook page several times of one of Sommer's Bible readings in Indianapolis that included an African-American student. So Lipscomb is talking about integration in the 1870s. Sommer's actually doing it. But the thing about Foy's comment, as outrageous as it was, and there's no way I think that you can defend it personally, but the point that Terry makes is everybody else at that time thought the same. Foy would just, to go back to your point of being sort of the point of the spear, he was the guy that had enough brass to say it. But that kind of unenlightened racial, I would say, that kind of prejudiced racial view was something that was so common in the Jim Crow South that Wallace is simply saying, I mean, nobody stood up and said, "Oh, Brother Wallace, you're wrong. You shouldn't." I mean, they were all as silent as the tomb. And so it's real easy in a more, quote, enlightened era to look back and say, "Oh, these, benighted people were just so blind," and so forth, when we may have blind spots of our own in other areas today. But so, not to defend any of Wallace's views that I think were reprehensible on that point, but he was a product of his culture. I don't think there's any question about that. And nobody stood up and said, "You shouldn't say that." I mean, it was tolerated, if not applauded. But he was the point of the spear who would, sometimes to his own discredit, say things that other people simply wouldn't say.
So with Foy, and I'm gonna try to bring us back in a little bit to Foy, but I want to, you told quite a bit on 88, and you brought up something that I want to talk about. In 1973, the Herald of Truth.
Yeah, the Memphis Meeting.
Yes, sir. So when I talked to Alan Hires about it, if you remember, he said, "You're probably going to be disappointed." He said, "I don't remember a whole lot about that." Do you remember?
Yeah, I have a transcript of it somewhere and read it pretty soon after it came out. So, I mean, it was, yes.
Okay.
I read it at the time.
It was in Gospel Guardian, Robert Farish had the headline.
Robert Farish. Yeah.
Oh, Farish, pardon me. He said, "I told you so." And that's what I said to Alan Hires, or I asked him, I said, "Did everybody have a sense of, boy, this is about the biggest picture of the conglomeration that we could have possibly had."
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, the connection where we can't ignore the connection between Foy Wallace and B.C. Goodpasture, what they both were editors. Homer Haley had preached at Fifth and Highland, and so they're making their move. And this is what you said, it's Judges 2.
Yeah.
You can go from Homer Haley to Lynn Anderson and have this massive gap, and it's so incremental. Who sees it coming? And so if it happens that way, Homer Haley and Lynn Anderson, would you call that incremental? Yeah,
I mean, that's how it's the frog in the pot of boiling water.
Right.
That analogy. And I think most people, when that 73 meeting transcript came out, I'm not sure how many people saw it, but I would say my reaction, and probably a lot of people, was not so much "I told you so," although I'm happy for Robert to say that, but it was like, what do you expect?
Right.
I mean, this has been coming, and anybody who knows anything about how these things develop historically, you probably should have seen this coming. So Robert Farish, by the way, who knew my grandfather, he preached in Indianapolis at one point, but also preached in Lexington. And I'm trying to think of the guy who was the librarian at Lexington Theological Seminary, but a friend of mine who came along later and was preaching but did some research there, and the guy's name will come to my mind in a minute, but he said, most of you Church of Christ people don't have any idea about the Restoration Movement, but he said, Robert Farish used to come in here and do research. He knew what he was talking about. So Farish was kind of steeped in the knowledge of how past controversies had developed, and that's probably the basis of that article. I don't remember that article specifically, but...
Well, he did, and I thought he was right to do it.
Okay.
It boiled down to, when they started looking on the inside of Herald of Truth, it wasn't even like having a conversation with anybody. You couldn't figure out who to talk to.
Yeah.
One minute we're talking to the elders, then we start finding out, well, the elders didn't even fire E.R. Harper. These other people did. And then it comes down to, well, who am I having a conversation with here?
Yeah.
And so that's where we are again.
Yeah.
We have right now so many people that, well, I mean, I've got a director over here, and it's like, oh, well, that's who we need to talk to? Well, I mean, we got the board of trustees over here, too. And oh, by the way, we're under the oversight of this eldership that's not even close by.
Yeah. Well, I think most of the people in the non-institutional who followed the camp, or group of churches, whatever, who followed this, knew a lot of that was going on, because I don't know if you've ever read the Willis-Inman debate, Cecil Willis's debate with Clifton Inman, who was a pretty big figure in the Ohio Valley College circle. It was 1966, and Cecil did a lot of research on the internal workings of the Herald of Truth. Got a lot of their literature somehow, had found out a lot about their finances and so forth, and so there were a lot of people who followed these debates who were knowledgeable about the institutional, non-institutional controversy, who already had some idea of what came out 7 years later in the 73 Memphis meeting. Yes. So it was like, well, we've been knowing about that for a while.
Well,
so there was financial mismanagement, I guess you would say, that a lot of the money that was being spent was not used for evangelism. It was used to grease the machinery of the organization, of the institution itself.
Between secretaries and on and on and on, which this is just a side note, but that's one of the things that I immediately saw when I read the biography of B.C. Goodpasture, was when he was in the discussion to start a Nashville School of Preaching. It immediately blew into president, vice president, chairman, secretary, and it was just this massive, like, I thought we were going to teach Bible over here, and it turned into everything else.
Institutions take on a life of their own.
Well, a quote that came out that, again, so when I went to school, like I said, and I don't know if it does anything for this conversation, I was put out of Memphis when I went.
Okay.
So, I mean, like I said, I don't do the parties, and I'm not trying to just...
You were put out in the sense of...
I was expelled.
Really? Okay.
I did 1 year there, and they do summer classes, and I was 19. I had a Bible study that I was going to do that was going to make me miss 1 day of the summer classes, which aren't that important, if we're all being honest. That's how they feel about them. Huh. But I sent just an email instead of asking permission. I told my instructor that I wouldn't be in class because I'd be performing a Bible study at a tent meeting that I was at. We had 1 week off for break, and in that 1 week I went back home to help the tent meeting, gospel tent meeting, had a Bible study, and I said I'll be in class on Tuesday, but I'll miss Monday because I got a Bible study. And so I was told, well, if you don't come back on Monday, you're out of school. Huh. And so I just said, okay.
I had no idea.
So
like I say, I know dots, but I don't always connect them.
But they weren't telling us that y'all even existed to look at the literature. So there's a quote that came out of 73. He did say it then. He also said on the radio. Yeah. Lynn Anderson said,
the big sick denomination.
The Church of Christ.
And I mean every one of those three words, big and sick and denomination.
So that's around 73.
Yeah.
And he gets grief for it. But what people don't know is that in 1962, Ed Harrell was already saying that. Yeah. And he had this is a booklet, The Emergence of the Church of Christ Denomination. Yeah. And so that's one of those moments where I tend to think the commonality of the left and the right is that they don't like what they're seeing in the middle.
Yeah.
So
I had a conversation with Don Hames once. I don't know if you know who Don was or not, but about as far on the left wing as you could get in Churches of Christ, probably, in the 60s anyway. And very knowledgeable about Restoration history, and ran the library at CTS for a long time. But he and I were sitting in a room at Bethany College. We had just heard Leroy Garrett and Ed Harrell kind of exchange views. And Don said, you know, the one thing that you and I both have in common is neither one of us could get published in the Gospel Advocate.
Well, the other two also, they weren't going to.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But I do think that I don't like the idea of where I say, you know, Lynn Anderson says big, sick denomination, but 11 years before that, Ed Harrell was already saying the emergence of the Church of Christ denomination. I don't like that when someone hears me say the similarity, where then someone says, oh, well, we'll never figure anything out. If the left and the right have this similarity, then why bother? Well, I think there's going to be a right idea. And and it might, do you?
I'm happy for whatever commonality exists wherever it exists. I mean, I think the Bible teaches truth, and whoever finds and understands that truth, I am happy for it. Does that mean that we work together in some intra-congregational way? No, I don't think. I don't think you think that either.
No,
but I am happy to have conversations in which we discover that yes, we share these things in common.
Right. Then this is just a note, just for my curiosity. Were you following that very, very much in '73, or was it just a thing of it figures?
It's hard to overestimate how much of an irrelevancy what was happening in institutional churches were to most people in NI churches, because you know they had been told to go play in the traffic, to go start your own congregation, kicked out of churches, and so we just grew apart. And so what, something that much of a flashpoint where you get this big blow up in the Herald of Truth, that caught some attention, but then it was like, okay, what's next?
Well, my thought on that, as I look backwards, and this is just my take, young guy looking backwards, I wish, well, one thing I don't have a problem saying is I do wish that you guys would have made more out of it, because I think it could have helped people that were up in it.
Okay.
And so when I said, we both agreed a moment ago, there's always going to be the 7,000, but there's only going to be one Elijah. And so what I wish could have happened differently was Elijah and Isaiah, their prophets, they go back and forth into these camps. And so, I mean, you guys were told to go play in traffic. I just wish that there could have been, as you're saying now, it couldn't have been less important that it happened. Like, because it was a huge, in my mind, it was a huge opportunity.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Do you think if somebody had stood up and said, whether it would be me or Cecil Willis or Ed Harrell or somebody, and said, this is the natural outgrowth or consequence of what, how could you not expect this to happen? Do you think anybody would have listened to that in the institutional?
Well, I will say this. This is, like I said, looking backward, this is my ideal view.
Okay.
I like you. And I like Ed Harrell. So I tend to think, yes, there would have been a collection of people just like the way I get my hands on your material years later. I think it would have been very, very good.
I don't think anybody listened much when Ed said it in '67 or whenever that. I think that's when he first put that out. But maybe so. I mean, again, it's a counterfactual. But I think the idea was nobody in the institutional churches are going to listen to anything that an auntie says. Now, maybe that was a wrong calculation. That might have been, I mean, you may be right. Maybe if somebody had said that, I just don't know how to answer that. But I kind of think not.
Okay. Well, and then, so I don't want to, beat up. One thing that I thought was odd as I went through 1973, I was expecting to find so much stuff, and that's just my ignorance. But I was expecting to find so much stuff, whether it be in Truth Magazine or if it be in Gospel Guardian. And I found more stuff on Ed Fudge. Right? And I couldn't, my thought was, looking back, if Ed Fudge wants to go, let him go. But man, you got this massive That's
so
just-
it was big on your radar, but and the Ed Fudge thing was not of interest to you, whereas
Oh,
the
it
reverse.
is.
Okay, the reverse was true at least for many of us, and I think the thing with Ed Fudge was again a kind of an incrementalism, where somebody who eventually winds up as an elder at Bering Drive, or at least a member at Bering Drive, one of the most, I would say, from what I know, farthest left congregations among churches of Christ.
Yes.
Even back in the 60s and 70s, that was true, and then teaching what he does on annihilationism. But he wouldn't have said all of that in 1973. He's still trying to present himself as, I'm just the same old North Alabama country boy I was when you knew me as a kid. Not maybe in so many words, but that was the idea that was being sold, is that I'm being misrepresented and you don't really quote me correctly and so forth. When in fact, those of us that actually talked to Ed personally, maybe this is your backroom conversation point again, we knew exactly what he was thinking and saying, because he would be maybe more open about it in private conversation than for public consumption, put it that way. At least that was my experience with him, as somebody who actually personally talked to him.
Right. And I mean, if that's how it was, I mean, I get it where someone says, well, what can I do about it? I know this is what's going on, but he won't put it out, so of course that is going to happen.
Well, the other thing about, since you brought it up, about, any controversy, not just the thing with Edward, a lot of brethren don't care about something until it lands in their backyard.
Yes.
So that some of us who were writing about different controversial things related to Ed and imputed righteousness and the whole Calvinistic orientation, we'd get a lot of flack from people saying, why do you have to write on that all the time? Why has every issue of Truth Magazine got something about this? Why are you always on this? Until somebody in their congregation or their area started teaching this. And why don't you guys write some more about that?
Right.
Where's all the material on this? Right. So a lot of it kind of depends on whose ox is gored, and how personal is this to me.
Yes.
So I know you're familiar with the syndrome.
When does a congregation start studying church splits?
When they're in the middle of it.
Or when it just happens.
Until it's too late, yes.
Right, yeah, so exactly that. This is a small one, but it's just my curiosity because it's you. When they did the 1973, if you're saying you weren't looking at it too much, did you know about in 1968 John Allen Chalk did some Herald of Truth talks about racism?
I knew it only from reading Richard Hughes's book. I think
Okay.
that's in Richard's chapter on.
Well, they all got bent out of shape.
Okay.
I mean, this is pre-speaking in tongues and all
Okay.
that. But I just wanted to ask you.
Yeah, see, in '68, I'm still a student at FC, and this was not really on my radar.
Okay.
So.
Well, that happened, and I wondered if I could ask such a question, based on Ed Harrell wrote the book, White Sex and Black Men in the South, and based on the response that it got in the Firm Foundation, they basically called him a smug, closed-minded.
Yeah.
And my question was, from '68 when John Allen Chalk did it, and if that's the take that Ed Harrell got on that book, do you think some of that could have been underlying in the '73 controversy?
Maybe so. I mean, I used that thing from the Firm Foundation in my speech that I gave about Ed posthumously. The Christian Scholars Conference did a thing on him at Lipscomb, and they asked me to, most of the other guys on there were professional historians, not members of the church, several of them anyway. And they asked me to talk about Ed as a preacher, and I used that Firm Foundation thing, and I may need to just pull the paper up and tell you what I said about it, but it was such a smug, condescending. At that time in '71, when that came out and that Firm Foundation article was written about Ed, I was a grad student at Emory, working with Walter Posey, who had been a kind of a mentor to Ed when he was a grad student. And this very smug, uninformed, totally ignorant review comes out in the Firm Foundation. Right. It was hard to know whether the most infuriating thing was it was so unenlightened and just plain ignorant. The guy didn't know what he was talking about. It was an anonymous review. Mm-hmm. Might have been Lemmons, I don't know, but whoever it was. But then it had this condescending sort of thing, mislabeled him as said he was a spokesman for the Disciples Historical Society. And I picked up the phone and called Ed, and I said, have you seen this article? And he said, yeah. He said the same day that came, I got the letter telling me that the book was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah.
So it kind of depends on whose opinion do you value.
Right. Well, I just, and I think that too, someone might say it's a bit ridiculous for me to even ask that, but I basically say, no, that's exactly how church politics go.
Yeah.
We find something I'm mad at right now,
Yeah.
and then I kind of like start pulling in the stuff that I didn't like also. And if you remember, I said a lot of these interviews, they're for young guys because they're going to start out in a local congregation. They're not going to necessarily know what's going on,
Yeah.
but they are going to have people pulling them in directions.
Sure.
And so I want to.
Well, I appreciate you doing this because, if those of us that have lived long enough to be a little long in the tooth, we sometimes can remember things that might be helpful to someone who didn't have that experience or wasn't around at the time. So I really appreciate you doing this.
Well, and I appreciate you giving me the time. You already did the 88 discussion. Can we talk about 1990?
Sure.
1990 Dallas meeting. So basically, individuals come back to you after 88 and they say, can we have like a round two?
Yeah.
And you...
But without the progressives.
Okay. Well, let me just ask that since we're going there. So Alan Cloyd basically had his background in Christian church.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know most of those people that were on the left side? You said you had been...
I knew at least of them. I mean, in my kind of Don Quixote-ish tilting at windmills, I would often go to the Tulsa Soul Winning Workshop, or I would go to the Abilene lectures.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would about once or twice a year, I would show up at these things, which was interesting because nobody knew me generally. I don't have a dog in this hunt, so I could sort of sit back and watch the infighting. So when I say I know certain dots, but I can't always connect them, I mean, that's how I got the dots. So yes, I knew who many of these guys were. And frankly, one reason for agreeing to do the Nashville meeting was I knew if you put some of these guys up on the stage that some of my students and others in the non-institutional churches who were sometimes saying, well, Steve, I think you exaggerate things, or you misquoted this guy, or it can't be that bad. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, all right, let's just put them in a room and let them say what they're going to say. Right. And I kind of knew what I was going to hear at Nashville. And then Dallas came along and we said, all right, let's pare it down and let's have a serious conversation among those of us that still think these are issues worth discussing.
Well, in 88, one of the names that basically right now that, like I said, if you look at Sand Creek, an editor of a paper uses a platform and he starts moving in a direction. Yeah. And open controversy to closed controversy. He would have been probably one of the youngest people on the platform at that time frame. But in 88, Denny Petrello
from Bear Valley
was a participant.
Yes.
And however, I would have said his name, maybe I'm wrong, but Randy Mayo.
Mayu, I think is how.
Okay, yeah. Randy Mayu. So him, I would say by 88, Rubel was out. I mean,
probably, yeah.
He was.
And I don't remember if Rubel spoke there. He was certainly at the meeting because I had this conversation with him. I'm kind of an impression, I didn't go back and look, I think he may have been not given one of the prepared speeches, but maybe a response. My memory wants to say on the same segment that Reuel Lemmons was on, perhaps, which was probably one of Reuel's last public appearances because he died in January after this meeting in December.
You have a slide where you had Reuel and Rubel listed as participant speakers.
Okay.
So if you're making some distinctions, I wouldn't know. I've never been able to find too much on the Nashville meeting.
Okay.
But I think that there's something to be said about the fact that Alan Cloyd was running that up, even though he dropped out.
Well, yeah, he dropped out. But yes, he was my original point of contact. He was the guy that came to me and said, can we work on something like this?
88, Reuel Lemmons had started Image magazine back in 83.
Right.
So you have all these figures, and then somehow Denny Petrello's in there.
Yeah, my only memory of that was I did not know Denny at the time. I don't even think I'd ever read anything, but my memory of it is that he gave one of the more substantive speeches from the institutional side. I mean, there was nothing of this nothing like Bill Sweatman or Randy Mayu or anything like that. He came prepared to talk about biblical issues. I remember being impressed, by somebody who had obviously done some homework and was willing to talk about it. Now, I don't know anything else about Denny.
Right.
Is he still at Bear Valley? Do you know?
He is the director of the Bear Valley School
Okay.
of Preaching. So, if you say he did one of the better jobs, then I'm happy for him and your opinion of it. But where we are right now, there was a quote earlier about Daniel Sommer when Carl Ketterside wrote about Sand Creek. His take on it was, he said, there was no option other than formal division. But where we are right now, we just have these people in the middle, these fence riders, like that quote from the young man. They can't keep working together. So individuals like Jay Lockhart and Stafford North, they would be bringing in personalities like Royce Money from Abilene.
Okay.
Very problematic. And so they're that middle piece. And Denny Petrella would never say one way or the other about it.
Okay.
And also he, basically reaching backwards, he would not comment to Jay Lockhart and Stafford North bringing in Royce Money and those characters. But he did say, but I will say this, he said, Tulsa Workshop did a lot of good. And so it's like, this is odd that you're on the lineup with all these guys in '88.
Yeah, back in the day when I went to Tulsa, I only went 1 year, but that was one of the more, I would call it wild and woolly workshops of all of the ones that I went to. It was, I heard some pretty far out things there.
Well, everybody knows what I think as far as, like I'm saying, inside of that institutional view. I would say that Denny Petrella was one of these people that's like, if you look at it, he's not this sound figure that you think he is.
So maybe would you put him in the same category as maybe J.W. McGarvey, who was a pretty conservative on some levels, but he was a bridge over which a lot of younger men walked on their way to places that McGarvey would never go himself.
That's exactly what I would say.
Okay.
So when you read the biography of Hall Lowry Calhoun, you're going to find J.W. McGarvey actually testifying in the trials that they had there. He wasn't helpful to the non-instrumental side.
McGarvey is a tragic figure, in my estimation.
That's my estimation. I didn't want to just beat him up. But
I think he labored at the College of the Bible and produced a monster that mocks his memory.
Yeah.
And basically, if he had lived long, they would have eaten him alive.
Yes. And I think that, so you saying that?
Yeah.
That is exactly where I'm putting these individuals. I don't hate them. I don't even dislike them. People tell me, oh, Denny's a good man. I'm sure. Like, if you're telling me he's like a good daddy, good husband, I'm not attacking him. But yes, now that you've said it that way, the bridge, he's the bridge.
Okay. And see, I think most people in non-institutional churches, they not only don't know this Denny, they don't know Bear Valley. They don't know what that is. What all of us are essentially concerned with is what's going on in the local congregation where I work and worship.
Yes.
What's happening out in the Brotherhood, whether the NI Brotherhood or the I Brotherhood or whatever, is only occasionally marginally relevant. And often what happens is when somebody comes into the congregation and begins teaching something that is either wrong or at least different, that's where you begin to get flashpoints.
So can I say to that too?
Please.
My primary is local work. That's what I want to be about the most.
Yeah.
That's what I want to be involved in and where my focus would be. That's what I'm actually trying to say back to these mainline institutional folk is no one right now essentially has a local work because everybody's traveling to be on everybody's program.
Okay.
And the endless ministries.
So my question to you would be, is anybody listening?
Yes.
You think so? Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Are they not just listening, that they know who you are and what you're saying?
So can I give you an example?
Are they being convinced? Yeah, please.
One of my classmates who's up in it, like I don't have much to do with him. He doesn't, we love each other immensely.
Okay.
But we just don't have too much. You asked, I'm not trying to toot my horn.
No.
Bear Valley at some point did get Stafford North. I don't know if Stafford resigned or if they asked him to leave, but He now, my friend, is an instructor at one of the schools of preaching, and he said to me, "You guys got Stafford North off Bear Valley." So right now, you asked. I don't.
So
like,
I'm happy to learn anything.
Okay.
Is Stafford still living?
No, he has died.
Okay. He was he was one of the guys that I knew before the Nashville meeting. He is a brother-in-law to Bob Owen, who was president at Florida College and who died just this last week.
Oh.
And then Roy Lanier Jr. I think I'm telling you that. Maybe you ought to get that off the tape. That might not be right. There's some family connection there.
Okay, we'll find it later.
Yeah.
But do you remember like the name? Oh, 1990, Wendell Winkler was there.
Okay.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, his son Dan.
Yes.
He's now acting as one of these bridges.
Okay.
Into progressive liberalism via Sunset School of Preaching. If you remember any of that.
Okay. See, I've heard things about Sunset, and I know a few guys who went there, but I don't know the whole backstory of.
Okay, so basically, right now it gets back to us. We put out the sound and the alarm.
Okay.
People start asking Dan, and I'm already getting reports back that Dan is having to defend himself.
Okay.
Phil Sanders, you remember Phil? You had
I
quotes.
do.
Phil Sanders, is this unbelievable to you?
No, it's not unbelievable. I have a question about Phil Sanders actually, or something that he said.
Well, Phil Sanders is acting as a bridge.
Okay.
We're sounding the alarm, and it basically gets back that he's getting it, he's hearing about it. So yes, people are listening and actions are being made.
Okay. I quoted Phil Sanders in this addendum that I did to L.A. Stouffer's book, where he said, this is on a lectureship maybe 6 or 8 years ago, that the NI churches now compose, he said, 23% of the whole church of anything that calls itself Churches of Christ. Now, normally the numbers have been estimated at something like 10, 12, 15%, which I think is believable. I think the only way that you get to 23% is if you lop off some of the progressive churches, some of which don't show much interest in even being considered Churches of Christ anymore, and then take them out of the equation. Yeah, now you might get to 23% of non-institutional churches. I don't know, but do you know, would you say that's a reliable statistic?
Well, I'm going to be honest. The only way I know that is through you. I already read that before coming here.
All right.
But when I read it, I thought 23 ain't bad. 23%?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'm not into counting churches, and I don't know how reliable that is. But, I don't want to number Israel.
Let me just say this. What you just said about it only works if we lop off.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't really know what y'all's statistics would be. As you just said, you're not too interested in what those numbers really are. But I'm saying from someone from Phil Sanders' perspective, he would have to start.
Yeah.
But here's my problem with that. We lop them off when we want to. We bring them back in.
I see.
When we want to.
Okay.
And basically, it depends on, for him, it depends on who's supporting his program in Search of the Lord's Way.
Yeah. What you've asked me, am I surprised about certain things? I mean, what is exceedingly clear to me is that there is a large segment of Churches of Christ, or things that have been called Churches of Christ in the past, that are firmly in the progressive camp. Some of them openly so. I mean, nearly all of the colleges, I would say, with the exception of maybe Freed Hardeman, maybe Faulkner, possibly Harding, though I think McClarty being kicked out probably indicates the road that they're on, and then with the graduate school moving over to Searcy, I would, but clearly the centers of power in the institutional Churches of Christ are lined up with the progressives.
They are.
I don't think there's any question about that. What's less clear to me, because I have only a few data points, is what's going on in the middle part of it that's still maybe in a flux. In other words, how many of them will wind up. And the last time I was at Freed Hardeman, I actually got up and asked a question in the open forum when the guy just recently retired from there. Who?
Is it Ralph Gilmore?
Yeah, Ralph Gilmore was running the forum, and somebody else got up and said something like, "Why don't we put some heat on these guys?" Meaning the progressives.
Yes.
And my comment, I was at the microphone opposite him, and my next thing is, you may not realize, but your ability to put heat on these guys doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
They don't care what Freed Hardeman does.
No, I believe that.
Yeah. So anyway,
When you said that, what's happening in the middle,
yeah.
right? You said the progressives are there.
Yes.
What's happening in the middle is they're massively uninformed.
That's my sense of
And
what's
they're
happening.
massively uninformed, though, because the Bruce McClartys won't inform them.
Okay.
That's my take.
Yeah.
You're the college president, and I can't get a direct, so you brought up Ralph Gilmore. Obviously, when Rubel Shelly did his thing in the 80s, he became like the spotlight. Ralph Gilmore is fellowshipping identical twins to Rubel Shelly.
Okay.
And they make no bones about it. The man right now, his name is Orpheus Hayward, and he says the church is a denomination. These denominations are our brethren. He's fine with instrumental music. And then here's Ralph Gilmore. And my thing is, you guys buried Rubel Shelly, and now you've opened the door for all these guys. And they basically come from Pepperdine.
Yeah.
They come from Pepperdine and get into freedom.
I'm on a couple of closed lists. I think you may be on some of them, or maybe they won't let you on, I don't know, but a lot of younger Memphis School of Preaching types. And I would say they are pretty much uninformed. I don't think they know anything about the institutional controversy much, and I don't think they seem to know much about, at least the data points that I know about what's going on among progressives. They don't seem to know that either. And they're pretty resistant to it.
Well, they would take that idea of, they would say, who cares?
Yeah.
I don't like that.
Yeah.
Because I'm saying, I think that you are a brother. And I don't like this business of saying, I don't know how I'm claiming kinship in Christ and then saying I don't care about Steve Wolfgang.
Yeah.
In 1990, there were great quotes. If anybody reads it, Roy Lanier asked Ed Harrell, are you loyal to the hermeneutic or the church? I thought that basically displays the glaring difference.
Yes.
And Ed said, I am loyal to the hermeneutic. Yeah. That was a partyistic question.
Yes.
I
totally agree.
We're going to move to old age.
Okay.
But I do want to ask you one more. Did you run into Leroy Garrett at 1990 Dallas meeting?
Yes, and the interesting thing about that was, of course, Leroy and I have, going back into the 60s, were on spoke on some of the Unity forums together. So I kind of got to know Leroy a little bit. The interesting thing about the Dallas meeting was that if you look at Restoration Review the month afterward, where he's very dismissive of the Dallas meeting, but then they had this LGBTQ group meeting in Houston that he thought was just great.
Yes.
I mean, it was like,
so
could not be a clearer counterpoint to where that particular hermeneutic leads.
Yeah, so to give you a reference point,
okay.
I clearly read your stuff. I read Ed Harrell and Reuel Lemmons. There's only 3 editions of Restoration Review that I haven't read.
Okay.
Because I can't get my hands on them. So I'm looking at everybody's stuff and saying, this is where we find ourselves right now.
Yeah.
In the mix of all of it. Someone asked Leroy, mixing and mingling at the Dallas meeting. They saw him moving. They said, you probably don't care a thing about any of this. And Leroy's response was, I care about the people. Yeah. And I appreciate that, because there's people who don't even care about
Leroy could be very acidic in press, but he was always, to me, very congenial in person.
That's what I've heard.
And I think that's true of a lot of people. I remember Alan Heyer said something similar to that. And I think, sometimes we're better in person than we are when we're sitting behind a typewriter or a word processor chewing each other up. Well, and that's one reason I've tried to keep personal connections open. Yeah. To say, I'm willing to talk. I recognize you as a brother. You have value because you are a brother. Yes. And I mean, not just you personally, your father, but whoever else names the name of Christ and is trying to preach the gospel. I want to value that relationship. If they're in the One Cup fellowship and churches with whom I have a lot in common. I mean, I didn't realize this, but what you just said about I read your stuff, that's what some of the One Cup brothers have said to me. Yeah, we read Truth Magazine. We read these kinds of articles, and for the most part, generally value it. But not everybody keeps the communication going the other direction.
I think that some people that when they hear this conversation that we've had, they will actually say, that you and I did nothing more than make a solid case for unity and diversity. Because when you start doing a history of the divisions and the personalities, I think that's where people come in and say, see, if you can do it over here, you can do it over there. If you could worship with a one-cup congregation, even though you don't believe it, you could put it aside for the moment and use it.
Yeah.
Then you say to Christian church folk, can y'all come over here and worship with us with no instrument? And they say, sure. But then we look at them and say, but I can't do it reverse. And I think as I look at the old ages, you actually have a note about this in your thesis. Maybe it's unexplainable. Why is it that when so many men get older, they just go back on everything that they did? And does that make a case? Like, if I keep counting the number of men that once they got old, they changed, why not save myself some time?
Yeah. I think we all change over time, so that, probably some issues that I felt were important when I was 30 or 40 perhaps are not as important to me now. I don't see how you could live a long life and not have changing viewpoints. I heard a well-known restoration guy in the institutional churches make the claim once that he'd never changed his mind on any major issue in his life. And I'm like, man, I just, I don't see how that just does not compute to me. But it's a puzzle to me how somebody can make such fundamental changes that they would kind of renege on things that were critically important and central to them as younger people.
Well, some William E., I don't know if you called him Bill Wallace quotes. He wrote about his dad that in 1947, Foy's exchange with N.B. Hardeman, Bill said that was my dad's deepest depression. And then Bill Wallace wrote the biography of Daniel Sommer, and Daniel Sommer has a quote of himself describing himself later in life. He said, our divisions were caused by men who strained at different Bible passages. And he said, and all of the strainers will come to grief sooner or later. Yeah. And so if someone says, well, Daniel Sommer changed later in life, Foy Wallace went back on his stuff, do you say Foy Wallace changed and went back to institutionalism?
I think Foy always was a straddle of it. I don't know how much he changed, but he was able to hold meetings in institutional churches until fairly late in his life. So was Homer Haley, for that matter, later than anybody else, pretty much in the institutional. And Sommer's change, I don't know how much of a change it was in the sense of he compromised on his convictions. I think he got to the point where he was willing to say, if you're not going to push, to strain, to use his term, if you're not going to push your viewpoint of saying you got to send to my college or your soul's in danger, then I can live with that viewpoint, and I won't be quite so vociferous about responding to that. So I think Sommer moderated in response to an equivalent moderation on the part of people that he had been engaged in controversy with.
Daniel Sommer did not say, put it in the budget. So it wasn't a change like that. But you go through the line, and there's Daniel Sommer, there's Foy Wallace. Carl Ketcherside was counted as a protege of Daniel Sommer, and he changed to ecumenicalism. Pat Hardeman, Edward Fudge, F. LaGard Smith was raised up non-institutional.
Yes.
And though Reuel Lemmons wasn't non-institutional, he underwent a large change at the end. And so you look at that, and I think that someone takes all this information and they say, if all these men got to that point and they had these big changes, and we look at all this, quote, depression that Bill Wallace wrote about in the division, why not just say unity and diversity?
Well, I have prayed the prayer that I've heard that others have, that I would not get old enough to put me in a position where I would betray things that in my younger years I felt were really important. But I do think that unity, to the degree it can be achieved, or at least not unity, at least some sense of recognition of brotherhood, I think that's really important. And, Jesus' last words on earth nearly dealt with John 17. I mean, it's a prayer that they may all be one. You know it as well as I do. So I think sometimes we have not put as much importance on that aspect of our fellowship in Christ as we have on Acts 2:38 or on what is the work of the church or things that I think are important. But I think we have to the degree that we can, continue to recognize each other as brother and as brethren, and to continue treating each other with respect and being able to talk about not only what are our agreements, but what are our differences. Yes. And you and I have not talked much about what our differences would be if we ever were trying to work together or worship in a congregation. We'd have to have that conversation. Right. And we might find that we actually don't have that many differences. I don't know. But I certainly, short of that, have to recognize you as a brother. And even people like, though I don't agree with maybe some of their positions, Bruce McClarty or Denny Petrillo, or people that I don't really have much contact with. But if they're brothers in Christ, then I need to honor that. So, and I think you're doing that too. And maybe not in the same way that I would, or that maybe some of your comrades might wish that you would. I just, again, I don't know much about what's going on.
And I don't count them as non-Christian and anything like that. I had somebody, a young guy, he said something like, "You can't kick them out of the church," and I said, "I can't take anybody out of Christ." No,
that's right.
So I'm not doing that.
I got a comment when the news of the Nashville meeting was going on. Somebody said, well, a friend of mine actually said, "Steve's trying to sell the farm."
Yes.
And I'm like, who's got the deed?
That's right.
I couldn't sell the farm if I wanted to. And I don't want it to do that. But I still would recognize, Alan Hires, or even Rubel, though I've not had any contact with him in succeeding. He made some kind of offer to buy lunch. Well, I'd buy him lunch if we wanted to sit down and talk about, how did we get to where we are and what are our differences as well as what are our similarities. I think these kind of conversations can be useful. That's one reason I enjoyed the conversation with John Mark Hicks, because we can sit down and say, I think this is dangerous. He thinks this is not safe. I think this is wrong. He thinks he doesn't agree with me about certain things, but we can have a discussion about that. And maybe because the stakes are not as high as if we were trying to worship together in a congregation. That would put things on I think a different level, a different plane than when we're, different parts of the country, maybe different parts of the world. I know brothers in other countries, some of which I've preached in, and others where I just know about them, that I wouldn't endorse everything that's going on there. Right. But I appreciate the fact that they're trying to recreate a biblical milieu and to do their form of restoring Christianity. That's an interesting article that you have there.
Which one?
The one you got from the Danville paper. How do you get your hands on that?
Well, that's what I wanted to start moving into. That'd be the wrap up. The way that you said that, if it were coming home to the local congregation, it would probably start having more meaning and more tension. I wanted to come talk to you because you have behind the meetings, like the Dallas meeting and the Nashville meeting, and behind the articles, you have solid local work behind you. Like I'm saying, your name.
I appreciate that.
And I do not like this idea of, hey, let's get 18 preachers that do nothing to sit at typewriters and bic ready. I don't want to do that. I'm not trying to create that. My focus is local work, and I would say this as we go out. I have a number of these.
Yeah. How did you come by? It was from the Danville paper, though. Where did you find that? I mean, I'm just curious.
Yeah. Stuff that's on the internet, you never know, right?
It is. The stuff's out there in the electrons that will be there as long as there are electrons. So, what else you got there? Things I have not seen in years.
This is just an example. Essays, this was quite frequent. I don't know how regular it was. You can tell me. Essays on the Scriptures by Steve Wolfgang. Can Christ plus nothing save one?
Yeah.
How often were you in the paper?
Every week, yeah. This was something that the church did. Originally, they gave us space free. Then we began to have to buy it. And eventually, I forget what, somebody pulled the plug on it. I think the paper, which is now near moribund. But this particular one, I'm responding to a local Baptist preacher who was on. I was also on the radio there, and we had, I forget whether he was right before me or after, but he preached this series on Christ plus nothing, and so I responded on the radio, but I also put an article in the paper and said, here's this idea that Christ plus nothing saves, and what does the Scripture say about it? So yeah, I did that. Actually, one of the first articles I did when I moved to Danville, 1979, I quoted 1 Peter 3:21, and the way it appeared in the paper was, the like figure whereunto baptism doth also not save us. The W was changed to a T. I don't think, probably not purposely, it's probably just a typo, but whether it was or not, I demanded extra space. They gave me a free column. They gave me another column to say, what I wanted to say. So I got to teach more about that point than if they just left it alone to say what it actually says.
And so this is what I'm telling. Do you have any idea how old you were?
Probably early 80s. Judging from the picture, I'm probably early to mid 30s.
Okay.
So your age.
I'm
maybe.
telling young guys, at home I write in the paper almost every week.
Yeah.
And I'm telling young guys, trying to get in the paper, it's something. Someone, there's no one reading it. It's something. Like you said, paper and radio. Nobody said you had to pick one over the other.
Yeah. And you never know where that goes. The Danville paper, in which some of these articles, and actually my predecessor who was there, who was a college classmate of mine, went to a prison in Missouri where a local kid, not a member of the church, his mother would just send him the local paper. His cellmate, who was from Columbia, got arrested for running drugs to try to pay for an operation for his mother, reads the Danville paper and reads these articles, and ultimately is converted and deported back to Columbia and started preaching there, started several congregations in this South American country before evidently being sucked back into drug trafficking. I don't know where he is today. He's probably dead, maybe dead.
Can I say something to
that? No
that?
idea.
Him being sucked back in does not take away.
No.
Like someone says, well, a lot of that.
Yeah.
No. That one person,
Yeah.
and then goes back home, and you played a role in that. And any young man could. That's what I'm saying. Any young man could.
You never know where your electrons are going to go.
And so then, these are notes of they're not behind the scenes, they're local work. So someone says, I don't like Steve Wolfgang going down to the 1988 Nashville meeting and whatever. But here's my thing on this one. 1985, you're in the paper for teaching 5 days a week, special Bible classes in the local congregation. So let me read a quote from there really quickly. The paper wrote, wearing a gray suit and dotted tie, gesturing, joking, and referring to sites in the Holy Land, Wolfgang could have been a professor at any theological seminary. Instead, it was a typical morning at Danville Church of Christ's special classes. A Bible school started in 1976 that draws students from, they called it, independent Church of Christ congregations across North and South America. And when they wrote this paper, you had students who had come from California, Arizona, 2 from Canada, and then also different parts of Indiana. Yeah. And so, do you think that...
Yeah, about 125 altogether over the years that I was there.
I think we should have more of that.
I agree.
Rather than...
This particular program was begun not as a kind of a dissatisfaction with, say, Florida College or any other Christian college. By the way, I almost went to Harding when I left FC. My dad kind of wanted me to go there. I wound up going to Indiana Wesleyan, but that's another story. But this was started to give an alternative, at least, to many of these students were a little bit older, as you can probably tell from the picture. These were not teenagers, but guys that had some life experience and decided in their 30s or 40s, I think I might like to preach. Now, we also had some 20-year-olds and even some teenagers that came in, but these were not kind of typical college students. And I think it's imperative that churches, to whatever degree they can, now they can't always do a 5-day-a-week thing, but find a young preacher and mentor him. Let them use the congregation where you are as a learning base.
Yes.
Give them, and we've got a young man we think coming in this summer. We've had an intern here every summer since except for COVID years. Some from different parts of the world. We're talking with a young man for next year who's from Germany. So, but I think, yes, more congregations certainly need to do more than we've been doing. The church is the pillar and ground of the truth. Local churches need to be in the business of helping young men mature in order to preach. So, hearty amen to...
Yes, amen to you for doing it. I think it's crazy that we can't have this, and we always just have to shoot these guys across the country, and it's like, well, do we not have elderships?
Yeah.
They can't teach them?
Yeah, exactly.
So you had this going. This was your local work. You were busy before 88 Nashville Meeting. Yeah. Someone says, I don't like Steve Wolfgang going over 1990 Dallas meeting. He ain't got nothing else to do. Local forum on pornography. You were having a public debate.
Yeah.
The cable company or local city trying to get into the pornography business, and you were opposed to it. You can tell by the picture you were not happy about it.
Well, I was probably thinking, I was up to speak next. But yes, this was a debate with, we'd had this whole long conversation, but we had the president of the Kentucky ACLU. I was teamed with a friend of mine who was at that time employed by Focus on the Family. And we were sort of the two guys opposing the head of the ACLU and the guy who was a lawyer who actually lost several of the cases that went to court. But yeah, I was... our local county attorney called me an activist minister because I was involved in issues that I thought needed to be spoken about publicly, that were moral issues. This and later an alcohol campaign. We had a local referendum on liquor by the drink.
Rotary host wet dry debate. Steve Wolfgang.
Yeah.
Hey, it's incredible. I really appreciate you.
I think as preachers we have to speak out on moral issues and be involved in our community.
Yes.
To the degree that we can, and so yeah, that's
really
looks like me. And I would have been what, maybe approaching 50 at that time.
Yeah. God bless you, Steve.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Look at capital punishment. You just were all over the place.
You've done your research, that's for sure. Yeah.
And it's like someone says, well, it's not directly related to the Bible. You made that directly related to the Bible.
Yeah. That's what I'm interested in. If it's related to Scripture, then I think Christians and preachers need to speak out about it.
Yes, and Christianity, real New Testament, biblical Christianity, should be setting tones for culture, not the other way around.
Amen. Absolutely.
They called you pastor. You could have been an elder. You could not have been. Local pastor goes into Europe, and you were over there, and you said, if you know English and you have a bit of an education, you can teach these people, and you're handing out Bibles in Europe.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that article.
This is 1989. This is a big one, like I said earlier. Were people still mad at John Allen Chalk over the racist comments?
Yeah.
People didn't like Ed Harrell's book, White Sects and Black Men. This says, Danville Church takes step toward breaking racial barriers. They called you pastor again. Steve Wolfgang, I know.
I tried to break him with that.
I know how that goes. They do it. I went to pray at a city council meeting, and they said, pastor?
Yeah.
Steve Wolfgang.
And at that time, I may have been an elder, so
That's
maybe
possible.
Technically I was.
Danville Church of Christ and evangelist Charles Davis stand in front of the building of East Lexington Avenue. Davis is preaching at revival meetings there this week, and Brother Davis is a black man.
Yeah.
And
well, we have several of the African American preachers that I, all the way back to, what you may not know, or maybe you do, but when Ed's book came out in 1971, I was preaching in Atlanta for a church in a black community. This was a church where the neighborhood had transitioned from largely white to largely black, and nearly every home study that I had was with an African American family there. And that's what made his book so powerful to me, and then to get this smart aleck review in the Firm Foundation just tripped my circuit board from top to bottom. But I'd always been interested. I would go down to Simpson Street, which was the big institutional black church in Atlanta. Andrew Hairston was the preacher there. He's in Richard Hughes's book. But I think it's imperative that we take the gospel wherever it can go, wherever we can help it go, whether it's in Eastern Europe or South America or in our own racial communities here in the States. And we had, and not just Charles, we had several African American preachers who came in and preached for us. And so,
well, those local, I appreciate your history takes, but it was the local things that I found where I said I'd kick myself if I didn't try to come talk to you.
Well, I'm glad you did.
And so I really appreciate you taking the time out with me. And also, you're going to be helping young guys. So, like I said about your stuff, however old it is, Ed Harrell's stuff, however old it is, it has found its way into my hands.
Well, I appreciate that.
All those years later, and so that's what I want to do with these.
Okay.
If we can keep these around, and they find itself into the hands of some young guys later on, and you and I do something with it, then that's why I'm doing it.
I appreciate your intentions, brother.
Thank you.
Thank
God
you.
bless you.
God bless you. And hope to see you again.
Yes, me too.
Perhaps such divisions are inevitable every 2 or 3 generations as new levels of sophistication are attained. People that I respect have told me so, but I would like to think that by learning from the past, by teaching with great patience and instruction, by recognizing the factors and circumstances of division, perhaps our children and their children can avoid the quick rush into another division which can never be healed. Maybe that task is futile. Some whose judgment I respect have said as much, but I must try. I thank you for your attention.